Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you are here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe a blanket, maybe a pillow, maybe a cup of something warm sitting close enough that you do not have to reach too far for it. Tonight we're going somewhere that looks very familiar at first. Not to a battlefield in France, not to the deck of an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, not to a bombed-out street in London, and not to a map room where generals lean over coloured pins and draw arrows across oceans. We're going home, to an American kitchen, to a front porch, to a grocery line, to a gas station with a sign in the window, to a living room where the radio is on low and everyone gets quiet when the news begins. Because when people talk about World War II, they usually talk about the places where the war was loud. They talk about Pearl Harbor, Normandy, Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Bulge, Midway, and the cities that shook under falling bombs. And of course they should. Those places mattered. They still matter. But tonight we're going to sit with a quieter part of the war. The part that happened in ordinary American homes where no one was wearing a helmet, no one was carrying a rifle, and yet the war was still there. It was in the cupboard. It was in the glove compartment. It was in the blackout curtain. It was in the little paper ration book tucked into a drawer and treated with the kind of seriousness that modern people usually reserve for passports, bank cards, or the last working phone charger in the house. The question tonight is simple, but the answer reaches into almost every corner of daily life. What were American civilians not allowed to do during World War II? At first, that may sound like a narrow question. Maybe you think of rationing. Maybe you picture sugar and gasoline and the famous posters telling people to save rubber, save metal, save fat, save paper, save almost everything. But the reality was larger than that. During the war, American civilians learned that freedom could become very specific. You could still go to the store, but you could not always buy what you wanted. You could still drive a car, but not as often, not as far, not always at the speed you preferred, and sometimes not at all unless you could prove a good reason. You could still cook dinner, but you had to think about the points, the stamps, the meat, the butter, the coffee, the canned goods, and whether using something today would leave you short next week. You could still keep your porch light on in some places, until the air raid warden told you that you could not. You could still speak your mind, but you were warned again and again that careless talk could travel farther than you meant it to. You could still live your life. You just had to live it with the war standing beside you, holding a clipboard. And here is the thing that I want you to really sit with for a moment. Most American civilians were not living under occupation. No foreign army stood on the corner telling them when to open their shops or what language to speak. For most people in the United States, the war did not arrive as rubble in the street or enemy soldiers at the door. It arrived as instructions. It arrived as forms. It arrived as rules printed in newspapers, as announcements on the radio, as posters in shop windows, as neighbourhood volunteers knocking on doors, as local ration boards deciding whether your family needed more gasoline than the next family. It arrived through ordinary channels. And somehow that makes it more interesting, because it shows how a war thousands of miles away could reach directly into the question of whether a mother could buy another pound of coffee, whether a father could replace a tyre, whether a teenager could borrow the family car for an evening ride, or whether a little boy could get a new pair of shoes before school started. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights low? Are you on a couch after a long day? Are you in a kitchen? Maybe with the hum of the refrigerator behind you, the very kind of ordinary abundance that would have amazed a family in 1943? Or are you somewhere quiet, letting this story run in the background while the modern world finally slows down a little? I always like imagining the little map of people listening from different places, all of us meeting for a while in the same strange room of history. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told not only through kings and battles, but through kitchens, street corners, grocery counters, and the small rules that shaped ordinary lives, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when it feels right. Maybe when some detail makes you pause. Maybe when you catch yourself looking at something in your own home differently. And if you want to share where you're watching from, or whether anyone in your family lived through the war years, leave it in the comments. Stories like that are often where history stops being a subject and becomes a room full of people. Now, let us go back. Not to the front lines, not yet. Let us go to the United States in the early 1940s, when a family could wake up in the morning, make breakfast, send children to school, go to work, stand in line at the store, listen to the radio after supper, and still have the war touch nearly everything they did. Picture an American town in 1942. It could be in Ohio, Oregon, Georgia, New Jersey, Iowa, or California. The details change from place to place, but the feeling is similar. There are service stars in windows, one for each son or husband or brother away in uniform. There are posters on walls and in store windows. A young soldier points outward and tells you that he wants you. A woman in work clothes tells you that she can do it. A ship sinks in a dark sea because loose lips have spoken too freely. A cheerful family plants a victory garden as if digging up the backyard were as natural as setting the table. Children collect scrap metal. Housewives save bacon, grease and coffee cans because fat can be processed into glycerin, and glycerin matters in making explosives. Boys gather newspapers and tin cans. Men who once sold cars now find there are no new civilian cars to sell, because the factories have turned to tanks, airplanes, trucks, guns, engines, and all the machinery of war. The country is not only fighting abroad, it is reorganising itself at home. That is the part we often smooth over when we tell this story. We say the home front, and the phrase sounds almost cosy. It sounds like knitting socks, and buying war bonds, and children planting tomatoes, and yes, all of that was real. But the home front was also a place of limits. It was where the government, local officials, employers, shopkeepers, volunteers and neighbours all began to enforce a new idea. Civilian life had to be disciplined because the military needed materials, fuel, food, rubber, metal, labour, ships, trains, and attention. Every unnecessary thing had to justify itself. Every private comfort had to stand before the question of the war effort and explain why it deserved to remain untouched. For a modern person, this can be hard to feel clearly. We live in a world where convenience is treated almost like a natural condition. If the store is out of one brand, we buy another. If we want to drive somewhere, we usually do, as long as the car works and the tank is full. If we need shoes, we order them. If we want coffee, we expect coffee to be there. If a room is dark, we turn on a light. If we are cold, we turn up the heat. If we are bored, there is a screen within reach, waiting with 1,000 distractions. Most of us are not accustomed to asking whether a national emergency has a claim on the way we spend our evening, the way we shop, the way we travel, the way we cook, or the way we speak at a diner counter. But during World War II, millions of Americans were asked to think this way every day. Some rules were formal. You could not buy rationed food just because you had the money. Money was no longer enough. That is one of the details that stops people when they first understand rationing. In peacetime, a store shelf is limited mostly by supply and by what you can pay. In wartime, a new layer appeared between desire and purchase. You needed the right stamp. You needed the right points. You needed to have saved them. And if you had used up your family's ration for that period, the answer was no, even if you had cash in your purse. A grocer could have coffee behind the counter, and you could have money in your hand, and still you could not simply buy it. The government had placed a paper gate in between. Other rules were practical but just as powerful. You could not drive wherever you liked without thinking about gasoline and tyres. Rubber became one of the most urgent civilian problems of the war. When Japan seized much of Southeast Asia, the United States lost access to major natural rubber supplies, and rubber was needed for military vehicles, aircraft, ships, boots, hoses, belts, and countless other items. A civilian tyre was suddenly not just a civilian tyre, It was a question of military readiness. So the family car, that symbol of American independence, became a managed object. People were encouraged and sometimes required to share rides, reduce trips, obey lower speed limits, and treat tyres as if they were precious equipment on loan from the nation rather than ordinary possessions. Think about that. The American car had become, by the 1930s and early 1940s, a deeply personal machine. It meant work, shopping, church, visiting relatives, teenage freedom, Sunday drives, courtship, errands, independence. Then the war came, and the government did not take every car away, but it reached into the habits surrounding the car and tightened them. The pleasure drive, the unnecessary trip, the casual use of fuel, the worn tyre replaced without much thought, all of these became suspect. Not always illegal in every exact form, not always punished in some dramatic way, but marked as wasteful, selfish, or unpatriotic. And in a small town that could matter almost as much as law. A neighbour did not need a badge to notice that you were driving too often. There were rules about light too, and those rules carried a different kind of feeling. Along parts of the coast, especially after German submarines began attacking shipping in American waters, coastal blackouts and demounts became a real part of life. The reason was direct and frightening. A ship silhouetted against the glow of a lit shoreline was easier to see from the sea. A city that let its light shine out over the water could unintentionally help an enemy submarine locate targets. So civilians were told to cover windows, dim signs, turn off unnecessary lights, shield headlights, and obey air raid precautions. In some places, wardens patrolled at night to make sure the rules were followed. Now, imagine being a child in that house. You already know that someone in the family may be overseas. You hear adults lower their voices when certain news comes over the radio. You see your mother carefully handle ration books. You see your father get irritated about gasoline. You collect scrap metal at school. And now, at night, someone tells you the windows must be covered because light itself might be dangerous. Not fire, not poison, not a stranger at the door, but light. The same thing that makes a home feel safe now has to be hidden. That is the kind of wartime logic that changes the atmosphere of a house. There were also rules around us words. This part is complicated because the United States did not become a place where ordinary conversation stopped, or where every citizen was silenced in the same way people were silenced under dictatorships. Americans still argued, complained, joked, gossiped, wrote letters, read newspapers, and listened to commentators. But the war created a constant warning around information. Do not talk about troop movements. Do not repeat rumours. Do not say when a ship is leaving. Do not mention where a soldier is stationed if that information is sensitive. Do not assume the person beside you at the train station, the lunch counter, the bus stop, or the barbershop is harmless. The phrase, "loose lips sink ships," became famous because it turned a national security concern into a sentence everyone could remember. There is something very human about that phrase. It assumes that people want to talk, and they did. They wanted to talk because they were anxious, proud, lonely, frightened, excited, bored, and desperate for news. A mother whose son had written from a base might want to tell her neighbour everything. A dock worker might know when a convoy was leaving. A factory worker might know what his plant was producing. A sailor home on leave might want to impress someone with details. Most careless talk was not treason. It was ordinary human speech running ahead of caution. The government knew this, and so it tried to make silence feel like a patriotic act. This is one of the themes we're going to keep returning to. During World War II, many civilian restrictions did not work only because police enforced them. They worked because people were encouraged to monitor themselves and one another. A ration book was official, yes, but shame did a great deal of work too. Posters did a great deal of work. Newspaper columns did a great deal of work. School teachers, ministers, shopkeepers, employers, neighbours, and children all repeated the same messages: save, share, do without, Keep quiet. Do not waste. Do not cheat. Do not complain too loudly. Someone has it worse. Someone is fighting. Someone is waiting for supplies. Someone's life may depend on whether you treat your own inconvenience as important or not. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to make this sound too noble, as if every American civilian accepted every rule with a smile and a war bond in hand. That is not true. People complained. People cheated. Black markets existed. Some drivers found ways around gasoline rules. Some shoppers tried to game the ration system. Some families had more than others. Some communities were watched more closely than others. And for Japanese Americans, the wartime state did something far more severe than ration sugar or restrict gasoline. It removed families from their homes and incarcerated them under a policy now recognized as one of the gravest violations of civil liberties in American history. That reality belongs in any honest account of what civilians were not allowed to do, because for those families, the answer was not only that they could not buy freely or travel freely, they were not allowed to remain freely in their own communities. So this story has more than one tone. It is not only a cosy account of sacrifice, it is not only a patriotic scrapbook of victory gardens and saved tin cans, it is also a story about pressure, fear, obedience, resentment, unfairness, community effort, and the strange way a democratic society changes when it goes to war. Most restrictions were temporary, many were accepted as necessary, some were abused, some were unequal, some were small enough to seem almost quaint now, others shaped entire lives. Let us return to the ordinary family because that is where the story becomes easiest to feel. The mother opens a kitchen drawer and checks the ration books. The father looks at the tyres before deciding whether a trip is worth it. A teenager learns that taking the car for no good reason is not just a family argument anymore. A younger child hears that sugar is short and wonders how something as ordinary as sweetness can be involved in a war. The grocer has to say no to people he has known for years. The gas station attendant sees frustration all day. The air raid warden walks the block at night, looking for thin lines of light around curtains. A factory worker avoids saying too much on the bus. A woman saves kitchen fat in a can and brings it to the butcher. A family plants beans where flowers used to be. Someone complains. Someone else says, "Don't you know there's a war on?" That sentence became a kind of key to the period. Don't you know there's a war on? It could be used seriously, jokingly, sharply, or wearily. It explained shortages. It ended arguments. It excused bad service. It justified waiting. It reminded people that private irritation had to make room for public emergency. And after a while, the sentence must have become exhausting. Because of course they knew. They knew when the radio spoke. They knew when letters arrived with parts cut out by censors. They knew when sons left. They knew when shelves changed. They knew when prices were controlled, when ration boards met, when factories hired, when trains were crowded, when lights went out along the coast, when posters told them that their smallest habit mattered. I think that is what makes this topic so revealing. War did not only ask American civilians for dramatic acts, it asked for repetitive obedience. It asked them to accept no again and again in small forms. No, you cannot have as much sugar as you want. No, you cannot buy new tyres just because the old ones are wearing down. No, you cannot use gasoline as if the roads exist only for your convenience. No, you cannot leave that light showing. No, you should not repeat that rumour. No, you cannot expect every product to be on the shelf. No, you cannot live as if the war belongs only to the men overseas, and there is something almost harder about small limits than large ones. A large sacrifice announces itself. It has ceremony around it. A small sacrifice repeats until it becomes the texture of the day. You notice it while making coffee, while packing lunch, while planning a visit, while standing in line, while patching something old instead of buying something new. You notice it when a child asks for a treat, and you have to explain points and stamps and ships and soldiers and supply lines in words a child can understand. You notice it when the family car sits unused on a pleasant Sunday, because pleasure driving no longer feels innocent. You notice it when a kitchen light is covered and the room feels dimmer than it should. That is where we're going tonight. Not into one single law or one single rule, but into the daily system of wartime limits that settled over American civilian life after the United States entered World War II. We are going to look closely at what people could not buy, where they could not drive, what lights they had to hide, what words they were warned not to say, how food changed, what materials disappeared, and how homes adjusted to rules that would have seemed strange only a few years earlier. For now, imagine the kitchen table again. It is 1943. There is a ration book nearby. The radio is speaking from the corner. Someone has folded a newspaper beside a coffee cup. Outside, the car is parked, but every mile matters now. In the cupboard, sugar is no longer just sugar. Coffee is no longer just coffee. Meat is counted, butter is discussed, canned goods are planned around. A pair of shoes may need to last longer than anyone expected. The family is not starving. They are not helpless. They are not living in ruins. But the old ease has gone out of ordinary things. The mother reaches for the ration book before making her shopping list. And that small movement tells you almost everything. Before she thinks about what the family wants, she has to think about what the family is allowed to have. Before money comes the stamp. Before appetite comes the rule. Before the meal comes the war. And once you understand that, the grocery store stops looking like a simple place of shelves and counters. It becomes one of the most important theatres of civilian life, a place where the war was measured not in miles gained or battles won, but in coffee, sugar, meat, canned peaches, cooking oil, and the little paper stamps that decided what could come home in a brown paper bag. The grocery store is one of those places most of us enter without much ceremony. You walk through the door, pick up a basket, move through the aisles, compare prices, maybe complain quietly because the brand you wanted is gone or the checkout line is too long, and then you leave with more than you planned to buy. It feels ordinary because it is ordinary. It is designed to feel that way. The lights are bright. The shelves are full. The choices are almost too many. Even when something is unavailable, there is usually something else close enough to replace it. Another cereal, another cooking oil, another kind of coffee, another bag of sugar, another can of tomatoes. You may not get exactly what you came for, but most of the time you still get to choose. Now take that same familiar act and move it back to the United States during World War II. The store is still there. The grocer may know your name. The wooden floor may creak under your shoes. There may be a scale on the counter, a cash register near the front, a stack of brown paper bags, a barrel of potatoes, tins lined up behind the clerk, and a chalkboard with prices written in a careful hand. But the feeling is different because money is no longer the only thing that decides what comes home with you. You can stand in front of the counter with cash in your hand and still be told no. Not because the grocer dislikes you. Not because the item is always gone. Sometimes it is right there, visible, close enough to touch. But if it is rationed, you need more than money. You need stamps. You need points. You need the small official papers that prove you're still allowed to buy your share. This is one of the quietest changes the war made in American homes, and it is easy to underestimate. In a country that had spent generations building a culture around buying, selling, abundance, travel and convenience, the war introduced a new habit. Before asking, "What do we want?" families had to ask, "What are we allowed to get?" That question followed them into kitchens and shops every week. It sat beside the shopping list. It stood behind the counter with the grocer. It waited in the drawer where the ration books were kept, often in the same place every time because misplacing one could cause real trouble. A ration book was not a souvenir. It was not a booklet of coupons in the cheerful modern sense. It was a household document. If you lost it, you had not just lost paper, you had lost access. The system was meant to solve several problems at once. The military needed food, fuel, rubber, metal, cloth, and shipping space. Allied countries needed supplies too. Merchant ships had to carry troops, weapons, machines, medical equipment, and raw materials across dangerous oceans. German submarines threatened shipping in the Atlantic. Japanese expansion cut off important supplies in the Pacific. Factories that once made civilian goods were now making war goods. And when demand rises while supply is limited, prices can climb fast. The government remembered the inflation and shortages of the First World War and wanted to avoid a civilian scramble where the rich could buy plenty and everyone else stood in empty lines. So rationing was not only about scarcity, it was also about fairness, or at least the attempt at fairness. The idea was that every person, rich or poor, would receive a share. You could not simply buy your way around the war. Imagine a mother in 1943 preparing to shop. She does not just take a list, she checks the ration books, she counts stamps. She thinks about red points and blue points, about meat and butter, canned vegetables and fruit, cooking oil, cheese, coffee, if coffee is still under rationing where she is in that period, sugar almost certainly, because sugar remained one of the great controlled items of the war. She knows what the family wants, but wanting has become less important. She has to think in days and weeks. If she spends too many points now, the end of the month becomes harder. If she buys canned peaches for a treat, that may mean fewer canned tomatoes later. If she uses sugar for a cake, there may be less for canning fruit, less for coffee, less for the little things that make a hard week feel more normal. Sugar was one of the first items to become a daily lesson in wartime limits. That makes sense when you remember how deeply sugar had entered American life by the 1940s. It was in coffee, tea, cakes, pies, cookies, preserves, breakfast foods, and countless small comforts that people did not think of as luxuries until the war made them count it. Sugar was also connected to shipping. Much of it came from places that required transport, and shipping space was now a military resource. So civilians learned to stretch sweetness. Recipes changed. Newspaper columns and government pamphlets offered instructions for using honey, corn syrup, molasses, or fruit to replace some of the sugar in baking. Cakes became smaller. Frosting became less common. Some desserts disappeared except on special occasions. Home canning, which the government encouraged, created another problem because preserving fruit required sugar. A woman who wanted to put up peaches or berries for winter had to plan carefully, sometimes applying for extra sugar for canning, and even then she had to justify what she needed. It sounds small now, almost quaint. A little less cake. A little less jam, but sweetness is never only sweetness. It is birthday cake. It is a spoonful in coffee before a factory shift. It is cookies for a child after school. It is jam on toast in a kitchen where the radio has just brought bad news. When sugar is rationed, the change is not only nutritional, it changes the emotional vocabulary of the home. Treats become decisions. Hospitality becomes arithmetic. A woman who once might have offered a visitor coffee and cake now has to think about whether that cake is worth the sugar, the fat, the flour, the time, and the points behind each ingredient. She may still offer it, because people still tried to be generous, but the act carries more weight. Coffee had its own place in the wartime household. It was rationed in the United States from late 1942 into 1943, and the reasons had more to do with transport than with an actual lack of coffee growing in the world. Coffee from Central and South America still existed, but ships, fuel and cargo space had to be used for war. U-boats threatened shipping routes, and the coffee that did arrive had to compete with military needs. For civilians, this meant one of the most ordinary morning rituals became another measured thing. People stretched coffee grounds, they reused them, they mixed coffee with substitutes, they brewed weaker pots and joked about how thin it tasted, because joking is one way people survive irritation without letting it turn into bitterness. Picture that morning. The kitchen is cold because the heat has not fully taken hold yet. Someone is getting ready for work at a war plant. Someone else is packing lunch. A child is looking for a school book. The newspaper is folded near the table. The smell of coffee should be strong and reassuring, but the pot is weaker than it used to be. The adults notice. maybe they say nothing. Maybe the father makes a remark about being able to see the bottom of the cup through it. Maybe the mother says it will have to do. Behind that little exchange is a global war. A submarine in the Atlantic, a cargo ship assigned to something more urgent, a government office setting rules, a grocer collecting stamps, and a family trying to begin the day. Meat changed the table even more. When meat rationing became part of everyday life, Americans had to reconsider meals that had been built around beef, pork, lamb, sausage, bacon, and canned fish. The military needed enormous amounts of meat for soldiers and sailors. Feeding an army is not a metaphorical problem. It is physical, constant, and huge. Millions of men had to eat every day, and food had to be processed, packed, shipped, stored, and served wherever the war had carried them. At home, meat became tied to red points, and different cuts had different values. A housewife did not simply ask what meat is cheapest or freshest. She asked what meat costs fewer points, what can be stretched, what can flavour a pot rather than dominate a plate. This changed cooking in practical ways. Ground meat could be extended with breadcrumbs, oatmeal, rice, or vegetables. Stews made sense because a small amount of meat could flavour a large pot. Organ meats, which some families already ate and others disliked, were promoted because they used parts of the animal that might otherwise be less popular. Liver, heart, kidneys, and tongue appeared in wartime recipes and advice columns. People were encouraged to try fish, beans, eggs when available, peanut butter, and cheese, though cheese itself was rationed too. A Sunday roast, the kind of meal that looked stable and prosperous on a table, became less common for many families. The question was not always whether you could afford the roast. The question was whether you could justify the points. Butter, fats, and cooking oils created another layer of difficulty. Fat is not glamorous in a historical account, but in a working kitchen it matters everywhere. It fries, softens, enriches, preserves, and makes food satisfying. Butter on bread, fat in a pie crust, shortening in biscuits, grease in a skillet, oil for cooking, drippings saved from meat, all of these had to be watched. The government rationed many fats and also asked households to save used cooking fat. Women brought waste fat to butchers, where it could enter the salvage system and be processed for war uses, including explosives. This is the kind of detail that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears. Bacon grease in a coffee can on the stove, scraped and saved, could be described as part of the war effort. A child might see his mother pour cooled grease into a container and be told not to throw it away because soldiers needed it. In that moment, the kitchen became connected to the battlefield in a way that was both practical and strange. Canned goods were another thing civilians could not buy whenever they wanted. This was not only because of the food inside the can, it was also because of the can itself. Tin plate, steel, and processing capacity mattered. Canned vegetables, fruits, soups, and juices were convenient, stable, and useful for both military and civilian life. The armed forces needed food that could travel and survive storage. Civilians needed processed foods too, especially in cities where people did not grow much of their own. So canned and processed foods were brought under the point system. Blue points became part of shopping. A can of peas, a can of peaches, a jar or bottle of processed food, these were not just items anymore. They were decisions. There is a mental load hidden in this system that deserves attention. The person doing the shopping, usually the woman of the household, had to manage price, availability, ration stamps, nutrition, family preferences, storage, recipes, and the calendar all at once. A modern shopper may compare prices and brands. A wartime shopper had to compare points. She had to know which stamps were valid, which had expired, and which ones she should save. She had to plan meals around what was allowed and what was actually available. Rationing did not magically make every shelf full. Sometimes stores still ran out. Sometimes people lined up because a shipment had come in. Sometimes rumours moved through a neighbourhood faster than the delivery truck. If word spread that a grocer had coffee or meat or canned fruit, people noticed. The store itself became a place of discipline. The grocer had to collect stamps and follow rules. He could not simply sell a rationed item under the counter without risking punishment, though black markets did exist. The customer had to surrender the correct stamps along with money. Children learned that the little papers mattered. They watched adults handle them carefully, tear them out, count them, argue over them, save them. Some families kept ration books in envelopes. Some tucked them in kitchen drawers. Some carried them in purses with the seriousness of legal documents. The books belonged to individuals, not simply to the household. Even babies received ration books, because rationing was based on people, and every person counted in the system. That detail is worth pausing over. A baby with a ration book. A child too young to read, too young to understand war, too young to know why ships sink or armies move, still had a place in the rationing system. The government had calculated that even the smallest civilian body had claims and limits. The family might use that child's points as part of the household total, but the fact remained. The war had reached the cradle. It had entered the nursery not as a bomb or a soldier, but as a booklet of stamps. Shoes were another controlled item that changed daily life in a very physical way. We tend to think first of food, but clothing and footwear mattered. Leather and rubber were needed for the military. Soldiers needed boots. Equipment needed materials. Civilian production was restricted. Shoes were rationed, and families had to make them last. This was especially hard with children, because children grow whether there is a war on or not. A boy's feet do not stop because rubber is scarce. A girl cannot keep wearing shoes that pinch just because the country needs leather for boots. Parents patched, repaired, handed down, and delayed. Shoe repair shops became more important. Soles were mended, heels were fixed. A new pair of shoes was not bought casually, it was planned. Think about the difference between wanting new shoes and needing them. In peacetime, that difference can be blurred by fashion, comfort, pride, and habit. In wartime, the difference became official. A person might want a new pair because the old ones looked worn. But if the shoes still functioned, perhaps they had to last. People were encouraged to care for shoes properly, polish them, repair them, rotate them if they had more than one pair, and avoid unnecessary wear. Children were told to be careful in ways children have always been told to be careful. Except now the warning carried national weight. Do not scuff them up. Those have to last. We cannot just buy another pair. Some items disappeared from ordinary civilian life, not because they were formally rationed in the same familiar kitchen table way, but because production had shifted. New cars were not available for civilians for much of the war. Refrigerators, washing machines, radios, typewriters, bicycles, stoves, and many metal goods became difficult or impossible to buy new, depending on the period and the item. Factories that had made consumer products now made aircraft parts, ammunition, trucks, tanks, ships, and military equipment. A family whose washing machine broke could not assume a replacement was waiting in a showroom. A small business that wanted a typewriter might face restrictions. A child who wanted a bicycle might discover that bicycles too had entered the world of rationing and priority. This is another part of the story that complicates the image of American abundance. The United States in the 1940s was an industrial giant, but during the war that industry was not pointed toward civilian comfort. It was pointed toward victory. That meant the home had to absorb the consequences. Old things stayed in use. Broken things were repaired. Spare parts mattered. People saved screws, jars, string, cloth, paper, and metal. The phrase, "use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without," became more than a slogan. It described a household economy built around delay. You delayed replacement, you delayed convenience, you delayed desire. The new could wait because the war could not. There is something revealing about the way people responded. Some took pride in it. They treated careful use as patriotic. A patched coat, a repaired appliance, A meal built from leftovers, a garden in the yard, a saved ration stamp, all could be framed as participation. Others were tired of it. They resented the lines, the paperwork, the shortages, the feeling that every ordinary act had become supervised. Both reactions could exist in the same person. A woman could believe deeply in the war effort and still feel irritation when she could not get enough sugar for canning. A man could support rationing and still grumble over shoes, tyres or coffee. A family could save fat and buy war bonds and still complain around the dinner table. Patriotism did not make inconvenience disappear. It only gave inconvenience a reason. Rationing also made inequality visible in uncomfortable ways. The official system aimed at fairness, but people did not enter the war with equal resources. A family with a garden, a cow, chickens or relatives on a farm could manage differently from a city family dependent on stores. A household with money might not be able to buy unlimited rationed goods legally, but money still helped in other ways. It could pay for repairs, storage, transportation, restaurant meals when available, or access to social networks that made shortages easier to navigate. Some people cheated. Black markets offered meat, gasoline and other goods outside the legal system. The government condemned this behaviour strongly because every illegal purchase threatened the moral foundation of rationing. If some people could get extra by paying more or knowing the right person, the promise of shared sacrifice began to weaken. The moral language around rationing was everywhere. Posters did not simply say supplies are limited. They told people that waste helped the enemy. They told housewives they were soldiers in aprons. They told children that salvage mattered. They connected small choices to men overseas. This could be inspiring, and it could also be heavy. Imagine being responsible not only for feeding your family, but for doing it patriotically. Imagine standing in a kitchen, looking at a small amount of meat, a limited amount of sugar, children who are hungry, a husband working long hours, prices to watch, points to count, and a poster telling you that careful meal planning is your duty. The poster is not wrong exactly, but it does not wash the dishes, it does not stretch the butter, it does not make a tired child stop asking for something sweet. There were cookbooks and pamphlets to help. Newspapers printed ration-friendly recipes. Home economists advised women on nutrition, substitutions and menu planning. Radio programs discussed ways to cook with less meat, less sugar, less fat. The government encouraged victory gardens so families could grow vegetables and reduce pressure on commercial food supplies. People canned at home, dried foods, saved leftovers, and learned to think of waste as almost shameful. A stale piece of bread could become crumbs, bones could become soup, bacon grease could be saved. Vegetable water could be reused in broth. Nothing was supposed to vanish without purpose. For many older Americans, especially those who had lived through the Great Depression, this was not entirely new. They already knew how to stretch food, repair clothing, and live with less. The 1930s had trained millions of households in thrift before the war gave thrift a uniform and a slogan. That matters because World War II did not arrive in a country of endless comfort. Many families had only recently begun to recover from years of unemployment, bank failures, farm hardship, and economic fear. For them, wartime shortages may have felt frustrating but familiar. The difference was that during the Depression, scarcity often felt like abandonment. During the war, scarcity was given a purpose. That purpose did not make people comfortable, but it changed the story they told themselves about doing without. There is a scene that appears again and again when you read Homefront Memories. The line. People waiting outside a store, sometimes before opening, because they heard something had arrived. Coffee, meat, sugar, shoes. A shipment of canned goods. The line was not only a practical arrangement, it was a social space where people traded news, complaints, recipes, rumours, and judgments. Someone might talk about a son in the Navy. Someone might mention a neighbour who had been caught misusing stamps. Someone might complain that the point values made no sense. Someone else might say that soldiers had it worse. The line held the whole emotional range of the home front: patience, resentment, pride, fatigue, gossip, and the constant effort to be fair. Children absorbed all of this. They learned that asking for things was different now. They learned that candy was not guaranteed. They learned that shoes had to be protected. They learned that tin cans should be saved and paper collected. Some children enjoyed the sense of participating. Scrap drives and school programs made the war feel like an adventure in small tasks. Others simply felt the limits. A birthday cake might be smaller. A favourite food might vanish for a while. A mother might say no with a ration book explanation that made sense to adults, but not to a child. Wartime childhood in America was not defined by hunger for most, but it was marked by the repeated discovery that the adult world had become serious about ordinary things. And then there was the grocer, standing at the centre of it all. His job became more difficult than it looked. He had to manage inventory, rules, customers, stamps, point charts, price ceilings and tempers. He might be accused of favouritism if one customer got something another did not. He had to refuse people without making enemies. He had to keep records. He had to obey the Office of Price Administration while keeping his business alive. In a small town, this meant rationing was personal. The person telling you no might have known you for 20 years. He might know your children, your church, your husband, your debts, your habits. Wartime bureaucracy did not always appear as a distant office. Sometimes it appeared as a man behind a counter saying, "I'm sorry, but I can't sell you that without the stamps." That sentence carries the whole system inside it. I'm sorry, I can't. Without the stamps, it is polite, firm, and final. It shows how law entered daily life through routine speech. No soldier needed to stand in the store. No dramatic scene was required. The customer either had the stamps or did not. The grocer either followed the rule or risked punishment. The purchase either happened or it did not. This is how a global conflict became part of a Tuesday morning. By the middle of the war, many Americans had adjusted. They may not have liked rationing, but they knew how it worked. They knew which books to bring, which stamps were valid, how to stretch points, how to trade recipes, how to plan around shortages. Human beings are very good at making routines out of disruption. What feels impossible at first becomes normal through repetition. The ration book that once seemed strange becomes just another thing to remember before leaving the house. The weaker coffee becomes the morning coffee, the repaired shoes become the shoes, the smaller dessert becomes dessert, the line becomes part of shopping. The grocer's no becomes one more sound of the war, but normal does not mean easy, it means practiced. Every limit still had to be managed by someone. Every saved point represented a decision. Every meal carried planning inside it. Every household had to translate national policy into dinner, breakfast, school lunches, work lunches, birthdays, holidays, sick days, and ordinary evenings when everyone was tired and no one wanted another lecture about sacrifice. This is the part of homefront history that deserves more attention. The war was not only fought by people making dramatic choices under fire, it was also sustained by people making small choices under pressure, again and again, until those choices form the shape of civilian life. So when we ask what American civilians were not allowed to do, the first answer is not only that they could not buy sugar, meat, coffee, canned goods, butter, shoes, or other items whenever they wanted. The deeper answer is that they were not allowed to behave as if buying was a private act with no public consequence. They were not allowed to treat abundance as automatic. They were not allowed to let money alone decide who deserves scarce goods. At least in theory, the war had made the shopping basket part of national planning. It had taken the most ordinary kind of freedom, the freedom to walk into a store and buy what you could afford, and placed it under the discipline of shared emergency. Now the mother closes her ration book and places it back in the drawer. The groceries are put away carefully. The sugar is measured. The coffee is stretched. The meat, if there is meat, is planned for more than one meal. The shoes by the door are not new, but they will be polished and repaired. Somewhere in the kitchen there may be a can of saved fat waiting to be turned in. The family has what it needs for now, though not always what it wants. Outside, the family car sits in the driveway or at the curb, and that car carries another set of rules entirely. Because even after you had managed the ration books, even after the food was counted and the stamps were spent, there was still the question of where you could go, how far you could drive, how fast you were allowed to travel, and whether the trip you wanted to take was important enough to use gasoline and rubber in a country at war. The family car looked innocent sitting outside the house. That is one of the strange things about it. It did not look like a military object. It did not look like a problem for Washington, or a matter for government boards, or something that belonged in the same conversation as aircraft carriers and troop convoys. It was just the family car. Maybe a Ford or a Chevrolet or a Plymouth, parked near the curb or in a small driveway, with dust on the fenders and a child's handprint on the window. It was the thing that took a father to work, carried groceries home from town, brought a family to church on Sunday, and made a visit to cousins 2 counties away feel ordinary. Before the war, it had been one of the clearest symbols of American freedom. You could get in, turn the key, and go. Then the war came, and that simple act began to need an explanation. Not every trip became illegal. Not every road was closed. No one placed a guard at the end of every street telling people to turn around. That is not how this restriction worked for most Americans. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more irritating because it entered the mind before the trip even began. You started asking yourself questions that would have seemed strange only a few years earlier. Is this drive necessary? Do we have the gasoline for it? Will it wear the tyres too much? Can we combine this errand with another one? Can someone ride with us? Can we walk? Can we take the bus? Can it wait until next week? The road still stretched out in front of you, but the war had placed a hand on your shoulder before you reached the door. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to think about what the automobile meant in American life by the early 1940s. Cars were not new anymore. They were not rare machines that only the rich had seen. For millions of families, the car had become woven into the rhythm of daily life. It changed where people worked, shopped, worshipped, dated, visited, and rested. It let rural families reach town more easily. It let city families escape into the countryside on weekends. It gave young people privacy, or at least the dream of it. It made distance feel smaller. A road trip could be a vacation. A Sunday drive could be entertainment. A car ride after dinner could be a way to cool off, talk, flirt, think, or simply get away from the house for a while. That last part is important. The family car was not only transportation, it was relief. It was a little movable room, with windows open and the sound of tyres on pavement, where a person could feel that the day had loosened. During the Depression, even families with little money sometimes used the car as an affordable escape, if they could spare the gasoline. You might not be able to afford a hotel, a restaurant, or a proper trip, but you could drive out past the edge of town, look at farms or hills or the river, and come home feeling that something had happened. It was a small pleasure, but small pleasures become important when life is hard. World War II did not look at the family car that way. The war looked at it as rubber, gasoline, steel, labour, delivery capacity, road use, tyre wear, and competition with military needs. The car's meaning changed because the materials inside it changed. A tyre was no longer just a tyre, it was natural rubber, and natural rubber had become one of the most urgent shortages in the country. Before the war, the United States depended heavily on rubber from Southeast Asia. When Japanese forces took control of many rubber-producing regions, the supply collapsed at exactly the moment the American military needed rubber for trucks, jeeps, aircraft, ships, boots, hoses, seals, belts, and equipment of almost every kind. The military could not function without rubber. A civilian tyre worn down by a pleasure drive was suddenly not a private matter. It was part of a national calculation. This is the detail that makes gasoline rationing more understandable. Americans often assumed gas rationing was mostly about gasoline, and of course fuel mattered. Tankers were under threat. Shipping routes were strained. Military needs came first. But a major reason for limiting gasoline was to keep people from driving so much that they destroyed their tyres. If you could not get new tyres, then every mile on the old ones mattered. A car with a full tank and bald tyres was still useless. So the government went after miles. It went after speed. It went after habits. It went after the kind of casual driving that had once seemed harmless. Tyres were among the first civilian goods brought under control after Pearl Harbor. New tyre sales were restricted almost immediately while local boards were organised. Think about that for a moment. The United States had just been attacked. Men were enlisting. Factories were shifting to war production. Newspapers were full of maps and warnings. And in towns across the country, ordinary citizens were being drawn into tyre ration boards, deciding who could get replacements and who had to make do. A farmer might need a tyre to get produce to market. A doctor might need tyres for house calls. A war worker might need the car to reach a plant that had no bus service. A family wanting new tyres for a summer trip would not be treated the same way. The rule was not simply who wants one, it was who can prove need. That word, need, became the centre of civilian driving. Need is a serious word. It strips away the soft edges of preference. Before the war, a person might say they needed to drive to a neighbouring town because they wanted to shop there, or needed to visit friends because it had been a long week, or needed a vacation because everyone was tired. Wartime officials narrowed that word. Work mattered. Essential business mattered. Medical care mattered. Farm production mattered. War industry mattered. Certain professional duties mattered. The Sunday drive did not matter in the same way. The trip to see scenery did not matter. The visit that could wait began to look irresponsible. A nation at war had very little patience for driving with no purpose except pleasure. When gasoline rationing became nationwide, the windshield sticker told a story before the driver said a word. The basic A sticker was for ordinary drivers, the people who were allowed a limited amount of gasoline for essential personal use. A B sticker could allow more for certain business needs. A C sticker went to people whose occupations required more driving: doctors, clergy, some war workers, and others whose need could be justified. There were other classifications too, including motorcycles and trucks. The point is not that every American instantly understood every detail perfectly. They did not. The system could be confusing, and it changed over time, but everyone understood the larger message. The car was being sorted by purpose. Your right to gasoline depended on who you were, what you did, and whether a board believed your driving served the war effort or a real necessity. Imagine pulling into a gas station under that system. Before the war, the station was a place of motion. A bell rang when the tyre crossed the hose. An attendant came out. Gasoline flowed. Oil was checked. A windshield was wiped. There might be a rack of maps, a soda machine, a calendar on the wall, and someone talking about baseball or weather. During the war, the same scene carried a new tension. The attendant had to see the ration coupons. The sticker on the windshield mattered. The amount mattered. The customer's explanation might matter. A driver who felt entitled to gasoline could be told no. A person used to buying fuel with cash discovered that cash alone had become insufficient, just as it had at the grocery counter. The gas pump had joined the ration book. There is something almost personal about being limited in how far you can drive. Food rationing affects appetite and household planning, but gasoline rationing affects movement. It changes your sense of the possible. A map looks different when every mile has a cost beyond money. A family gathering looks different when getting there requires coupons that might be needed for work. A date looks different when driving around for an hour becomes wasteful. A teenager looks at the family car and sees freedom locked behind his parents' ration arithmetic. A salesman who once covered a territory by road now has to prove his mileage is essential. A doctor may receive extra fuel, but also the pressure of knowing why he has it. A farmer may need gasoline for production, but still face inspections and paperwork. Everyone has to account for motion. Then came the speed limit. The wartime victory speed of 35 miles per hour was one of those rules that sounds simple until you imagine actually living with it. 35 miles per hour. Not just in a school zone or a town street, but as a national wartime standard meant to save rubber and fuel. Higher speeds wore tyres faster. Lower speeds extended their life. The rule made mechanical sense. It also changed the feel of the road. American drivers had already begun to love speed, not always extreme speed, but the steady confidence of moving quickly through open space. The car promised that distance could be defeated. The war slowed that promise down. Picture a driver on a long road in 1943. The land opens out on both sides. The road is clear. The engine could easily do more. The driver knows it. The car knows it. But the speedometer must hover at 35. It is not a dramatic restriction. It does not look like sacrifice in the way a uniform looks like sacrifice. It is simply slower, mile after mile, slower. A trip that once took 2 hours now takes longer. Trucks move slower. Families move slower. Everyone is asked to accept that the tyre tread beneath them is part of the war. There is something almost comic about it until you remember the stakes. An impatient driver was not only breaking a rule, he was wearing away rubber that the country could not easily replace. The government and wartime advertisers tried to make these restrictions feel patriotic, rather than merely annoying. Posters urged people to share rides. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler became one of the most memorable and blunt messages of the period. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. The idea was to make empty seats feel shameful. If one person drove alone to work while 3 neighbours made the same trip separately, that was wasted gasoline and rubber. Car clubs, carpools and ride-sharing were promoted as civic duties. Employers adjusted schedules. Workers were encouraged to carry more passengers, plan routes, and treat the automobile less as a private possession and more as a shared tool. That must have changed the social life of commuting. A person who had enjoyed the quiet of driving alone now had to make conversation with neighbours or co-workers. A woman going to a factory shift might ride with people she barely knew. A man who valued privacy might find himself expected to fill every seat. The morning drive became a small collective arrangement, with pickups, waiting, delays, and the mild irritations that come when private routines become public. And yet it also created community. People who might never have spoken now rode together. They traded news. They complained about ration boards. They talked about sons overseas, production quotas, rumours, movies, weather, and the strange fact that even the empty seat beside them now belonged to the war. Public transportation became more important, but also more crowded. Buses, streetcars and trains carried workers, soldiers, sailors and civilians, trying to avoid using gasoline. Railroads were heavily burdened by troop movements and military freight. Civilians were encouraged not to travel unnecessarily by train because seats, schedules and equipment were needed for the war. The idea of a carefree vacation became difficult to justify. Vacation at home was promoted not simply because it sounded wholesome, but because the transportation system was under strain. If a family could stay near home, they should. If a trip was not necessary, the war had an answer for it. Do not go. The phrase pleasure driving took on a new harshness. Before the war, it sounded harmless, even pleasant. Pleasure driving meant fresh air, scenery, courtship, family time, escape from routine. During the war, the same phrase could sound selfish. In some regions, especially where shortages were severe and enforcement tightened, non-essential driving was banned or strongly restricted. This did not mean that every American who took a short, unnecessary drive was dragged into court. Enforcement varied, and resentment was real. But the idea itself mattered. The government had named a kind of movement as unnecessary. That naming changed behaviour. If you drove to work, that could be defended. If you drove to a doctor, that could be defended. If you drove for the pleasure of driving, You might have to explain yourself to an officer, a ration board, a neighbour, or your own conscience. I want to linger on the neighbour for a moment because wartime rules were not enforced only from above. They were also enforced sideways. People watched one another. They noticed who still seemed to drive often. They noticed who got extra gasoline. They noticed who claimed essential need but appeared at a picnic miles away. They noticed the car parked outside a movie theatre, or a beach, or a roadside diner. Some of this noticing came from genuine patriotic concern. Some came from envy. Some came from the ordinary human pleasure of catching someone else breaking a rule. Wartime sacrifice can bring people together, but it can also make them suspicious. If you're doing without, you want to believe others are doing without too. A person with a C sticker might be respected or resented depending on how people saw him. A doctor driving at night to a patient was obviously necessary. A businessman with extra gasoline might be viewed less generously if neighbours thought his trips looked too comfortable. Local ration boards carried real power because they made decisions close enough to affect people personally. A request for more gasoline was not an abstract application disappearing into a distant capital. It could be judged by people in or near your own community. People who knew local roads, jobs, distances, and sometimes reputations. That made the system practical, but it also made it intimate. Your mobility could depend on whether your need sounded convincing to people who might know your name. There were appeals, exceptions, and arguments. Of course there were. Americans did not stop being argumentative because there was a war on. Drivers complained that their allotments were too small. Rural residents argued that cities had buses and streetcars while they had long distances and no alternative. Western states complained that gasoline itself was not scarce in the same way everywhere, and that the rubber argument did not always calm local frustration. Business owners worried about lost income. Families separated by distance felt punished for wanting to visit. The government answered with the same basic point. The country did not have enough rubber for unlimited civilian driving. The military came first. Essential work came next. Pleasure came later. This created a new geography of civilian life. The places you could not drive were not always marked by signs. They were created by ration limits. A beach might still be open, but if driving there used gasoline meant for work, it was effectively out of reach. A grandmother might still live 2 towns away, but visits became less frequent. A scenic road still wound through the hills, but the Sunday drive along it became harder to defend. A distant church supper, a county fair, a fishing trip, a dance, a roadside attraction, a visit to friends, all of these had to pass through the filter of fuel, tyres, coupons, and purpose. The country did not shrink on the map, but it shrank in practice. That is one of the hardest things for modern people to understand because we often think of restriction in terms of closed doors. During wartime driving limits, many doors remained technically open. The road was there, the town was there, the family car was there. But the means of going had been narrowed. Your world became smaller not because someone erased the destination, but because the cost of reaching it had changed. A family might look at a map and decide no, not because they did not want to go, not because the trip was impossible in a mechanical sense. Because the gasoline had to be saved, the tyres had to last, and the war had made staying home feel like the responsible choice. The automobile industry itself had changed too. New civilian car production stopped during the war as factories turned to military production. This meant the existing cars had to last. There was no easy assumption that a worn-out vehicle could be replaced with a new model. Mechanics became important. Spare parts mattered. Drivers were told to maintain engines, inflate tyres properly, rotate tyres, avoid fast starts and sudden stops, and keep cars in good repair. Careless driving was no longer just bad for the car, it was bad citizenship. A heavy foot on the accelerator, a hard brake, a poorly inflated tyre, these could all be described as waste. The driver's habits were now moral habits. There is a small domestic scene hidden in that. A father kneels beside the car with a tyre gauge checking pressure. A child watches, maybe bored, maybe curious. The father explains that tyres last longer if they are properly inflated. Before the war, this might have been ordinary maintenance. During the war, it becomes a lesson. We cannot waste rubber. The army needs rubber. We have to make these last. The child may not understand the Dutch East Indies, synthetic rubber production, military transport, or the Office of Price Administration. But he understands that the family car must be treated carefully because something bigger than the family depends on it. That is how national emergencies enter childhood, not always as fear but as rules around objects. Gasoline stations changed as businesses too. Some reduced hours, some faced shortages, some had to manage customers who were angry about limits. Attendants checked tyres, watched stickers, handled coupons, and sometimes became the face of a policy they did not create. A driver frustrated by rationing might take that frustration out on the nearest person with a pump key. The station owner had to keep records and obey regulations while trying to stay open in a world where driving itself had been deliberately reduced. Less driving meant less business. Patriotism did not pay every bill. Many civilian businesses on highways, roadside restaurants, tourist cabins, amusement places and resorts felt the decline in travel. When the government told people to vacation at home, entire local economies heard it. The effect on dating is worth noticing because it shows how deeply the rule reached into ordinary life. By the early 1940s, the car had become important to courtship. It offered privacy in a culture where many young people lived with family and public spaces were watched. A young man with access to a car could take a young woman to a movie, a dance, a diner, a lake, a lookout, or simply out driving. Gas rationing complicated all of that. A date now had a fuel cost. A father might be less willing to lend the car. A young man might not have enough coupons. A couple might walk, take a streetcar, double with friends, or stay closer to home. Romance did not disappear, but it had to share the front seat with the Office of Price Administration. So did family obligations. A sick relative, a funeral, a wedding, a holiday visit, a birth, a child at school, a husband at a distant work site. Each situation forced people to ask whether the trip counted as necessary. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes extra gasoline could be requested. Sometimes public transportation could be used. Sometimes families simply did not go. That is a quieter kind of loss than the losses usually associated with war, but it is still real. Wartime restriction did not only limit luxuries, it interfered with the web of visits and errands that holds families together. A missed Sunday dinner does not appear in a battle history. A postponed visit to an aging parent does not become a famous photograph. But these were the small absences out of which civilian wartime life was made. In rural areas, the situation could be especially tense. Rural Americans often had fewer alternatives to driving. A farm family might live miles from town, school, church, markets, doctors, and suppliers. Gasoline was not a convenience there in the same way it was for a city family deciding whether to drive instead of taking a streetcar. It was tied to production and survival. Farmers needed fuel for trucks, tractors, and necessary travel. The government recognised this through classifications and allowances, but paperwork never perfectly fits real life. Weather changes, machines break, animals get sick, markets shift. A farmer could believe in the war effort and still feel that distant officials did not understand his roads. City dwellers had their own difficulties. Public transit could be crowded and uncomfortable. War workers travelled at odd hours. Women entering factory work in large numbers had to navigate transportation systems not always designed for their schedules or safety. Buses and streetcars filled with workers, uniforms, lunch pails, shopping bags, and fatigue. The car might sit at home while the family reorganised its day around timetables and shared rides. The loss was not only speed, it was control. When you drive yourself, you leave when you choose. When you depend on a bus, a carpool, or a crowded train, your time belongs partly to other people. there is also the sound of it to consider. A street with fewer cars sounds different. A highway with slower traffic sounds different. A Sunday afternoon without the usual stream of pleasure drivers feels different to store owners, gas station attendants, children, and anyone sitting on a porch. The war changed the volume of civilian life. Not everywhere equally, not all at once, but enough that people noticed. Roads that had promised movement became reminders of restraint. A parked car could say as much as a moving one. It said the family was saving gas. It said the tyres had to last. It said the war was present even in stillness. Some people found ways around the rules. That has to be said plainly. Black market gasoline existed. Coupons could be stolen, forged, traded illegally, or misused. Drivers lied about need. Some people drove for pleasure and hoped not to be caught. Enforcement could include traffic stops, checks of windshield stickers, ration board hearings, and penalties. Newspapers and magazines covered cases that made the system visible. A person caught without the proper sticker or misusing gasoline could become an example. The government needed compliance, and examples helped. But every black market sale and every false claim also revealed something uncomfortable. Shared sacrifice is easier to praise than to practice. Still, millions did practice it. They slowed down. They shared rides. They stayed home. They planned errands in loops. They patched tyres. They learned to drive gently. They gave up vacations. They accepted that the car could no longer be used whenever the mood struck. Not perfectly, not cheerfully every day, but often enough that the restrictions worked as part of the larger mobilization. The United States was trying to move armies across oceans while keeping civilian society functioning at home. That required ships, trains, trucks, tyres, fuel, and discipline. The family car was small, but there were millions of them. Small waste multiplied by millions becomes large waste. Small savings multiplied by millions becomes strategy. I find myself thinking about the emotional adjustment more than the rule itself. The rule says 35 miles per hour. The rule says ration coupon. The rule says no pleasure driving. But the emotional adjustment says your private wishes are no longer private in the same way. The war has an opinion about your weekend. The war has an opinion about your tyres. The war has an opinion about whether you drive alone, whether you visit relatives, whether you take the long way home because the evening is pleasant. That is a different kind of civilian life, not unfree in the absolute sense, but watched, measured, and morally instructed. Late in the day, the father may stand outside and look at the car. He has a reason to drive tomorrow, work perhaps, or a necessary errand. He knows how much gasoline is left. He knows the tyres are worn but still serviceable. He knows the speed limit, though the road to the plant is straight enough that the car could easily go faster. Inside the house, someone may ask whether they can visit friends over the weekend. There is a pause before the answer, not because the family does not care about the friends, not because the distance is great, because every trip now belongs to a calculation. Maybe they decide not to go. Maybe they write a letter instead. Maybe they invite someone closer. Maybe they save the gasoline for a doctor's appointment or for work. Maybe the teenager complains that nobody ever does anything anymore. Maybe the mother says, "There is a war on," in that tired voice people use when the explanation is true, but has been said too many times. The car remains outside, capable of movement, held in place by paper, rubber, fuel, and duty. As night settles over the street, fewer headlights pass than once did. The roads are not empty, but they are more purposeful. Trucks move with goods, workers ride together, a doctor drives because someone needs him. A bus carries tired people home from a factory shift. Somewhere a driver eases off the accelerator and lets the speed fall back to 35. The engine quiets a little. The tyres turn a little more gently against the road. The country is still moving, but not wherever it wants, not as fast as it wants, and not for every reason it once allowed itself. And when those cars reach the edge of town, or the coast, or a neighbourhood where the windows are covered and the porch lights are dimmed, another rule of wartime civilian life begins to show itself, because in some places it was not only movement that had to be controlled, light itself had to be hidden. Light is one of the easiest comforts to forget. You enter a room and touch a switch. The room answers. You open the refrigerator and a little bulb comes on. You step outside and a porch light holds the steps in place. A street lamp makes the corner familiar. A store sign glows after dark and tells you the town is still awake. We do not usually think of light as a public act. We think of it as private, domestic, harmless. It belongs to the lamp beside the chair, the kitchen window, the bathroom mirror, the headlights of a car turning into the driveway. It feels too ordinary to be dangerous. During World War II, in many American communities, especially along the coasts, light had to be treated differently. It had to be watched, covered, dimmed, shielded, and sometimes turned off completely. A lamp left uncovered was not only a lamp. A store window left bright was not only a store window. A headlight shining in the wrong direction was not only careless driving. It could become a mark on the land, a point of reference, a pale outline against which something at sea could be seen and attacked. In wartime, even the glow from a town could travel farther than the people inside that town intended. That is the part that takes a moment to understand. The danger was not always that enemy aircraft would appear overhead, though that fear shaped many drills and warnings. On the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, one of the clearest dangers came from the water. German submarines were hunting American and Allied shipping near the shoreline in 1942. Tankers, freighters, and merchant vessels moved along the coast, carrying oil, supplies, raw materials, and cargo the war could not do without. At night, if the shoreline behind them remained brightly lit, those ships could appear as dark shapes against a glowing background. The lights of hotels, boardwalks, houses, shops, amusement piers, lighthouses, cars and street lamps could help create the outline an enemy needed. Imagine being on shore and not fully understanding that at first. The boardwalk lights look cheerful. The hotel windows look normal. The town has always looked that way in the evening. The ocean is dark, the waves are steady, and somewhere out beyond the surf a ship is moving. To the people in town, the lights mean life is going on. To a submarine commander offshore, the same lights may help turn that ship into a target. That is the kind of wartime reversal civilians had to learn again and again. The thing that feels safe at home can become dangerous from a distance. So the rules came. Sometimes they came as full blackouts, sometimes as dime-outs, sometimes as drills, warnings, ordinances, newspaper notices, instructions from air raid wardens, or orders from military authorities. The details changed by location. A coastal town in Florida or New Jersey did not experience the war in exactly the same way as a farming town in Iowa or a neighborhood in Chicago, but the basic message spread widely enough that millions of people understood it. At certain times when the siren sounded or when local regulations required it, lights had to go out or be covered so completely that no glow escaped. There is a difference between turning off a light because you are going to sleep and turning off a light because someone has told the entire town to disappear. The first is rest. The second is discipline. A blackout was not simply darkness. It was organised darkness. It was a community pretending for a little while that it was not there. Houses still stood. Streets still crossed. Children still breathed under blankets. Dinner dishes still sat near sinks. But from above or from the sea, the town was supposed to vanish. Every window had to cooperate. Every careless porch light threatened the illusion. Inside the house, the work began before the siren ever sounded. Families had to prepare windows. Curtains were not always enough. A thin curtain could glow like a lantern if a lamp burned behind it. People used heavy drapes, blankets, shades, cardboard, dark paper, or specially prepared blackout material. The goal was simple and unforgiving. Stand outside and look back. If you can see light, it is not good enough. That meant bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms, basements, doors, stairwell windows, transoms, any little place where light might leak. A house that had once tried to welcome light now had to trap it. This changed the evening routine in small practical ways. Before a lamp could be turned on, someone checked the window. Before the kitchen light burned bright, someone made sure the shade was down. A child could not run out onto the porch and leave the door wide open. Someone going from a lit room into a dark hallway had to think about whether the outside could see. The habit of moving through a house became more careful. People learned where the curtains did not close properly. They learned which window had a gap near the sill. They learned that a crack under a door could look surprisingly bright from the street. Think about a mother trying to get children ready for bed on a blackout night. The children are not in battle, but they know something is happening. Adults are serious in a way children notice immediately. The lamps are covered, the curtains are heavy. Someone tells them not to touch the shade. Maybe they are excited because drills can feel like games at first. Maybe they are frightened because adults keep saying there is nothing to worry about, which is one of the clearest signals a child receives that there is something to worry about. The youngest asks whether planes are coming. An older child says submarines cannot come into the house, which is true and not especially comforting. The mother keeps her voice calm because calm is part of the work. Outside, the air raid warden walks the block. This figure became one of the most familiar symbols of American civil defense. Often a volunteer, sometimes a neighbor everyone already knew. The warden might wear a helmet, an armband, or other identifying equipment. His job, or her job in some communities, was not glamorous. It involved training, drills, routes, instructions, first aid knowledge, and a great deal of patience. The warden had to know the neighborhood well enough to move through it in darkness. He had to know who lived where, which houses had elderly residents, who might need help, which streets were difficult, where people gathered, and which families had a habit of leaving a light visible. There is something both reassuring and irritating about that. On one hand, the air raid warden was a sign that someone was looking out for the neighborhood. On the other hand, no one enjoys being told by a neighbor to turn off a lamp. Civil defense brought authority very close to home. It was not always a distant official speaking through the radio. It might be the man from 3 houses down, the one who usually trimmed his hedge badly, now standing outside in a helmet and telling you that your bathroom window was glowing. In another situation that might have been absurd. In wartime it was serious. The phrase people often associate with blackouts, especially from Britain, was, "put that light out." American wardens had their own local ways of saying the same thing. The words might be polite or sharp, depending on the person and the hour. A warden could knock, shout, blow a whistle, or report violations. Some people took pride in doing the job thoroughly, some took it too seriously, some were mocked, some were respected. The role gave ordinary civilians a small piece of wartime authority, and small authority can reveal a great deal about people. A careful warden helped a block feel secure. A bossy one could make the whole thing feel like a neighborhood argument with sirens. Blackout drills were exercises in obedience. The sirens sounded and the community was expected to respond. Lights went out. Cars pulled over or moved with restricted lights depending on local rules. Streetlights were shut off. Store signs went dark. Factories and offices followed prepared procedures. People checked curtains and waited. If the drill was successful, officials might announce that the town had achieved a very high percentage of darkness, as if darkness itself were a grade on a report card. A town could be proud of disappearing well. That's a strange thing to imagine now. A whole community congratulating itself because almost no one could see it. But the seriousness behind it was not imaginary. In the early months of 1942, ships were being sunk in American waters. News travelled, even when details were limited. Coastal residents sometimes saw flames at sea or heard of wreckage, oil, bodies and survivors. The war was not only across the ocean. In some places it was just beyond the beach, People who had spent their lives thinking of the Atlantic or the Gulf as scenery had to understand it as a battlefield. A beach town could still smell like salt air and fried food and summer wood, but offshore there might be men drowning in burning fuel. That is why the light rules could feel both inconvenient and necessary. A hotel owner did not want to darken his building. A shopkeeper did not want to turn off a sign. A family did not enjoy sitting behind heavy curtains in a stuffy room. Drivers did not enjoy shielded headlights. Cities did not enjoy dim streets. But when the reason was explained plainly, many people understood. If light from shore helped enemy submarines find ships, then light from shore had to be controlled. Dimouts were often less complete than blackouts, but more constant in some coastal areas. A blackout meant a full extinguishing or covering of visible light during a warning or drill. A dim-out meant reducing and shielding light so that it could not be seen from the sea or sky. This could involve lower wattage bulbs, shaded streetlights, covered windows, darkened signs, reduced automobile headlights, and restrictions on beachfront lighting. A city under dim-out did not always go completely dark, but it became subdued. The brightness was lowered, the edges were softened, the night lost some of its public confidence. Along the coast, this could change the entire character of a town. Boardwalks that once glowed became darker. Beachfront hotels had to cover windows facing the water. Neon signs were turned off or shielded. Amusement areas, restaurants and shops adapted or closed earlier. Streetlights near the shore were dimmed or painted. Cars moved carefully. People who had once walked at night under bright resort lights now moved through partial darkness, hearing the surf more clearly because the visual noise had been reduced. The coast did not stop being the coast, but the war changed how it looked after sunset. Inland communities practiced too, sometimes from fear of air raids, sometimes as part of general civil defence readiness. The United States was never bombed from the air in the way Britain, Germany, Japan and many other countries were. Most American cities never experienced real enemy bombers overhead. But in 1942, no one could be entirely sure what the war might become. Pearl Harbor had shown that distance was not a guarantee. Japanese submarines shelled a few coastal sites on the west coast. Rumours moved faster than facts. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many people worried about what might come next. Civil defence drills were partly practical preparation and partly a way to give fear a schedule. That matters. Fear without action is hard to live with. A blackout drill gave civilians something to do. Cover the window, fill the bucket, know where the flashlight is, listen for the siren, follow the warden, stay calm. These instructions may not have made everyone safer in a direct, immediate way, especially far inland, but they gave shape to anxiety. They told people that preparation was possible. A family sitting in the dark during a drill could tell itself that it was not helpless. It was participating. The darkness itself could be difficult. Modern people, surrounded by constant light, often forget how strongly darkness changes a room. With all lamps off and windows covered, a familiar house becomes strange. Furniture shifts into shapes. Corners disappear. A hallway seems longer. A child's bedroom, usually softened by a nightlight, or a lamp left outside the door, becomes a place of listening. You hear the clock. You hear footsteps outside. You hear the neighbour's dog. You hear someone coughing in another room. During a blackout, people were often told to avoid unnecessary movement, and so the house settled into a waiting stillness that was not quite rest. There were practical dangers too. Dark streets meant accidents. Pedestrians could trip. Drivers with shielded lights or no lights could collide. Elderly people had difficulty moving safely. People could fall on stairs. In Britain, blackout accidents became a serious problem, and although the American situation was different, the same basic risks existed wherever lights were reduced. Turning off lights solved one problem while creating others. War often works that way. A rule meant to protect ships offshore makes a staircase more dangerous for the grandmother inside. businesses had to change their habits. A shop window that once used light to attract customers now had to hide it. The sign that told people the diner was open might be dimmed or turned off. Factories working at night had to follow rules for shielding industrial light. Office buildings had to manage windows floor by floor. Theatres and restaurants had to adjust entrances and exits. A city's nightlife, already affected by rationing, transportation limits and labour demands, now had to contend with darkness as a regulation. Light, which had helped sell goods and create excitement, now had to be justified. For people in cities, the loss of light could feel especially unsettling. Urban Americans were used to a different kind of night than rural Americans. City night was never fully dark. It had signs, headlights, streetcars, apartment windows, theatres, drug stores, hotel lobbies, late workers, and a glow above it all. The city after dark was a sign of modernity. It said electricity had conquered the old limits of sunset. When wartime rules dimmed that glow, even temporarily, people were reminded that modern life could be reversed. The bright city could be made to behave like a village under threat. Rural people knew darkness better, but that did not make the rules meaningless. A farmhouse light can be seen from far away on a clear night. A barn lantern, a porch bulb, a car headlight on a country road, all stand out sharply where there is little surrounding glow. In rural coastal areas, this mattered. In inland areas, drill still required cooperation. Farmers and small-town families who were used to controlling their own schedules now had to listen for signals and follow community instructions. The war's reach did not depend on population size. A small light in a small place could still be treated as part of the national effort. There is a domestic detail here that feels especially revealing: the flashlight. During blackouts, a flashlight became more than a convenience, but even it had to be used carefully. You did not shine it out a window. You did not wave it around outdoors. Some people covered the lens partly or pointed it down. Batteries were not something to waste either. A flashlight in a drawer, checked and ready, became part of the household's civil defence equipment. So did candles, though open flames brought their own risks. Buckets of sand or water were sometimes recommended in air raid precautions, along with basic first aid supplies. The home became a small preparedness station. Children learned the rules through school as well as family. Teachers explained what sirens meant. Students practiced drills. Civil defence messages appeared in classrooms, newspapers, radio programmes and posters. A child might be told not to be afraid, while also being trained for the possibility of attack. This is one of those contradictions adults often hand to children during emergencies. Nothing is going to happen, but here is what to do if something happens. Children are very good at noticing the space between those statements. Some children found blackout drills thrilling. The darkness, the siren, the sense of secrecy, the warden outside, the whispering, all of it could feel like adventure if no real danger followed. Others found it frightening. The war had already taken fathers, brothers, uncles, teachers, neighbours, and older boys away in uniform. It had changed food, driving, shoes, and school activities. Now it changed night itself. A child who once feared imaginary things in the dark could now fear real ones described by adults. Planes, submarines, bombs, spies, saboteurs. Even if those dangers were unlikely in a particular town, the language of them entered the child's mind. Adults too had to manage imagination. During a blackout, people listened differently. A plane overhead could become a question. A distant siren could tighten the body. A car door outside could sound suspicious. In wartime, ordinary noises acquire explanations they do not deserve. Most nights brought nothing. Most warnings were drills. Most lights were covered and uncovered without consequence. But the practice itself trained people to think defensively. The home was still home, but it had become part of a larger map of possible targets. There was also irritation, because humans cannot live on solemn duty alone. People complained about the inconvenience. They complained about wardens. They complained about curtains. They complained about stumbling in the dark. They complained that drills came at bad times. They complained that some neighbours did not follow the rules. They complained that others followed them too eagerly. A blackout could interrupt cooking, reading, bathing, working, entertaining, or putting children to bed. It could make a hot room hotter because windows were covered. It could make a lonely evening lonelier. Even necessary rules wear on people through repetition. The social pressure around light could be sharp. A visible window was not only a mistake, it could be treated as selfishness. If everyone else had taken care to cover their lights and one household failed, that household endangered the collective effort. Whether the danger was immediate or theoretical, the emotion was real. Neighbours might mutter, wardens might report, newspapers might remind people that one careless light could undo the work of an entire block. The language of shared sacrifice, already present in rationing and driving, applied here too. You did not have the right to be casually bright while everyone else sat in darkness. That phrase, casually bright, captures something about the war years. Before the war, brightness had been a sign of progress. A well-lit home meant comfort. A bright store meant prosperity. A glowing city meant energy. During the war, brightness could become carelessness. That is a remarkable reversal. Civilians had to relearn the meaning of a lit window. They had to see it not from inside the room, where it meant warmth and safety, but from outside, from the street, from the sky, from the sea. Wartime asked people to imagine how their home looked to an enemy. That imaginative shift is not small. Most people naturally see their home from within. The chair by the lamp, the kitchen table, the bedroom window, the hallway bulb, these are intimate things. Civil defence forced the household to become visible to itself as part of terrain. Your window was no longer only your window, it was a point of light on a coast. Your porch was no longer only your porch, it was a marker. Your street was no longer only your street, it was a pattern that might be read. This is how war turns private space into public responsibility. In some places, blackout compliance was impressive. Reports praised neighbourhoods and towns for achieving near-total darkness during drills. Officials inspected, newspapers printed results, communities took pride in readiness. There is a certain civic satisfaction in doing a difficult coordinated thing well. The same pride that made people collect scrap metal or plant victory gardens could attach itself to darkness. We did it. We all turned out the lights. We followed instructions. We proved we could be ready. But readiness always carried the shadow of what readiness was for. A blackout drill without an attack is only practice, and practice can become routine. Yet the routine exists because somewhere, in theory, there may be a night when it is not practice. That possibility sat behind every covered window. It was less immediate for most Americans than for people in London, Coventry, Hamburg, Tokyo, or Manila, where air raids were devastating realities. Still, American civil defense borrowed some of its emotional weight from those places. People had seen newsreels of bomb damage. They had read about the Blitz. They knew cities could burn. Even if their own town was unlikely to be bombed, the idea of the bombed city had entered modern imagination. The irony is that for many American coastal communities, the more immediate value of reducing lights was not about bombers at all, but about ships at sea. A family sitting in a darkened living room might imagine airplanes overhead, while the practical military concern lay offshore, where a tanker's dark hull could be seen against a bright resort town. That difference between imagined danger and actual strategic purpose did not always matter to civilians. The instruction was the same: cover the light. The reason could be aircraft, submarines, sabotage, training, morale, or general preparedness. The action remained simple. Late in the evening, after a drill ended, the all-clear sounded. That sound mattered. It released the town back to itself. Curtains could open, lamps could be turned on, a porch light might return. People exhaled. Children asked if it was over. Adults said yes. The street regained its shape. The house became ordinary again, but not exactly as before. Once you have covered a window because light might help an enemy, you do not see that window in quite the same way. Once the town has vanished on command, you know it can vanish again. There is a scene I keep coming back to. A woman stands in a dark kitchen during a blackout drill, one hand resting on the counter. The dishes are not finished. The room smells faintly of soap, coffee, and whatever was cooked for supper. The radio has been turned low or off. The children are in the next room whispering because children rarely stay silent just because history has asked them to. Her husband may be at home, or he may be working a night shift, or he may be overseas. Outside, the warden's footsteps pass along the sidewalk. For a moment, the whole house is listening. Not sleeping, not working, not resting exactly. Listening. That listening is part of the home front too. It is not dramatic enough for a monument. No one receives a medal for standing in a dark kitchen waiting for an all clear. But millions of civilians experience the war through moments like that. The pause, the instruction, the small denial of ordinary comfort. Do not drive unless necessary. Do not buy without stamps. Do not waste food. Do not leave that light showing. The rules were different, but they all taught the same lesson. The private household had been recruited. When the lights came back on, people returned to their tasks. A mother finished washing dishes. A father checked the door. A teenager complained that the whole thing was ridiculous, unless he was secretly impressed by it. A younger child wanted reassurance. Someone adjusted a curtain that had not worked properly. Someone made a note to buy heavier material or fix a shade. The blackout became another item on the household list, somewhere between ration stamps, tyre pressure, saved fat, and letters to soldiers. The war was not always present as fear. Sometimes it was present as maintenance. Outside, the coast remained darkened where it had to be. Ships continued to move. Submarines continued to hunt. Patrols increased. Convoys changed the danger. Military tactics improved. Over time, the early vulnerability of American waters lessened, but the memory of those months remained in coastal communities. People remembered burning ships. They remembered oil on beaches. They remembered wreckage and rumours. They remembered the night the lights went out, not as a poetic phrase, but as a practical instruction shouted from porches and printed in newspapers. And still, even away from the coasts, the blackout left a mark because it showed civilians that ordinary visibility could no longer be taken for granted. To be seen was not always safe. To shine was not always innocent. To light a room was, under certain conditions, to participate in the geography of war. That is a hard idea to carry into a home, but Americans carried it. They carried it with blackout curtains, shielded lamps, covered headlights, dimmed signs, and the awkward discipline of moving through familiar rooms as if the outside world had a claim on every bulb. The family car has already been slowed and rationed. The grocery basket has already been measured by stamps and points. Now the evening window has been covered. The house still stands. The family still eats, talks, argues, listens to the radio, and prepares for bed. But the shape of civilian freedom has changed again. You may own the lamp, but you may not always show its light. You may live in the house, but the war has something to say about how it appears after dark. And once people had learned to hide their windows and lower their headlights, there remained another kind of brightness that had to be controlled. A brightness that did not come from bulbs or signs, but from speech itself. Because words could travel too, and officials spent much of the war reminding Americans that the wrong sentence in the wrong place could move farther than anyone intended. A spoken sentence feels weightless. That is the strange thing about it. You say something at lunch counter and it disappears into the noise of plates, coffee cups and chairs scraping against the floor. You mention a detail at a train station and the words seem to vanish into steam, footsteps, and the murmur of strangers. You repeat something from a letter while standing in a grocery line, and it feels like nothing more than conversation. No one has bought anything. No one has driven anywhere. No light has been left shining toward the sea. It is only talk. During World War II, Americans were told again and again that talk was not only talk. Words could move. They could be overheard, repeated, misunderstood, embroidered, carried from one person to another, and eventually land somewhere the speaker never imagined. A woman telling her neighbour that her son's ship had sailed from a particular port might think she was sharing family news. A dock worker mentioning a departure time might think he was complaining about his schedule. A factory worker describing what his plant was making might think he was being proud. A sailor home on leave might speak too freely because he wanted to impress someone, or because he was tired, or because for once he was sitting in a normal room with normal people, and the pressure of secrecy seemed far away. The problem was that wartime did not allow ordinary speech to remain completely ordinary. It placed a question behind conversation. Who else can hear this? That question followed Americans into restaurants, bus stations, train cars, offices, barbershops, beauty parlours, hotel lobbies, boarding houses, factory gates and kitchens, where the radio was still warm after the evening news. It did not always arrive as a law in the direct way rationing did. There was no stamp book for speech. There was no red point or blue point to spend before you mentioned a rumour. But there were rules, warnings, censorship offices, military restrictions, press codes, posters, and a national campaign that tried to make every civilian feel responsible for the movement of information. In a war fought across oceans, information was treated as a material, not as visible as rubber, not as heavy as steel, not as easy to count as sugar, but valuable all the same. The most famous warning was simple enough for a child to remember. Loose lips might sink ships. Sometimes the wording changed slightly. Sometimes posters used careless talk, or warned that spies were listening, or showed a sinking vessel, a dying sailor, a shadowy enemy figure, or an ordinary American speaking without thinking. The message was always the same. A few casual words might help the enemy. That phrase has lasted so long that it can sound almost like a joke now, something people say when they want a secret kept at work or in a family. But during the war, it was not meant as a light phrase. It was meant to make the mouth feel dangerous. Imagine seeing that poster every week. It is in the train station. It is near the factory entrance. It is in a government office. It appears in newspapers, in schools, on bulletin boards, maybe in the post office where people go to mail letters to sons overseas. A ship is shown sinking, or a sailor is shown in distress, and the cause is not a torpedo in the picture, not a submarine, not a bomber, but speech. Someone talked. Someone said too much. Someone thought one little detail would not matter. The poster does not ask whether that is fair. It does not explain the whole intelligence chain. It does not say that most people who talked carelessly were not traitors. It goes straight to fear and duty. Keep quiet, because men may die. That's a heavy message to place over daily conversation. It meant that wartime civilians were asked to develop an inner censor. Before saying something, they were supposed to stop and think. Is this about troop movements? Is this about a ship? Is this about a factory? Is this about production? Is this about where someone is stationed? Is this about when someone is leaving? Is this about damage from an attack, a military base, a cargo, a convoy, a training schedule, or a location that should not be repeated? The exact rules could be complicated, but the everyday habit was simple. When in doubt, do not say it. For many families, this habit began with letters. Letters were the lifeline of the war. A letter from a husband, son, brother, daughter, or sweetheart could change an entire day. People waited for the mail with a seriousness that is hard to reproduce now. We live in a world of instant messages, missed calls, photographs sent in seconds, and small updates that arrive so often they can become background noise. During World War II, a letter might take weeks. It might be delayed, damaged, censored, or lost. It might arrive after the news inside it had already changed. Still, people read and reread those letters because they were proof that someone existed somewhere beyond the map on the wall. But letters were not private in the way people wanted them to be. military mail could be censored. A soldier could not simply write whatever he wished about where he was going, what his unit was doing, what he had seen, or what was planned. Officers reviewed outgoing mail. Sensitive details were cut out, blacked out, or forbidden before they were written. Families at home learned to read around absence. A line might be missing, a place name might be vague, a date might be unclear. A son might write that he was somewhere warm, somewhere muddy, somewhere with terrible food, somewhere he could not name. The mother reading it at the kitchen table had to accept that the blank space was part of the war. There is something painful about censored affection. A soldier may want to tell his wife exactly where he is because he knows she lies awake imagining worse. He may want to describe the harbour, the field, the island, the town, the ship, the hospital, or the road, because specific details make separation feel smaller. She may want to know whether he is near danger, whether he is safe, whether the rumours in the newspaper are connected to him. But the war steps between them, not because it does not care about their marriage or family, but because military information has to be protected. So the letter becomes careful. Love remains, but geography disappears. V-mail made this even more practical and strange. Instead of ordinary letters travelling in bulky sacks across the ocean, many messages were written on special forms, photographed onto microfilm, shipped in miniature, then printed again near their destination. This saved enormous amounts of shipping space, which mattered because cargo space was not just a convenience. Every pound and every cubic foot could be needed for medicine, ammunition, food, machine parts, or military mail. But V-mail also made the written word feel processed. A private message became an image. A tiny photographed version of handwriting passed through a system built for war. People accepted it because they wanted contact, and because they understood that even love letters had to make room for logistics. At home, families learned not to repeat everything they read. If a letter hinted at a location, they were supposed to be careful. If a soldier said he expected to move soon, that was not gossip for the whole town. If a sailor mentioned a ship, a route or a port, that information had to stay inside the family, and sometimes even inside the silence between lines. A proud mother might have to hold herself back at church. A father at work might want to say more than he should. A younger sibling might overhear something and repeat it at school. The war turned family news into something that required judgment. That judgment was not always easy because people were lonely and afraid. When people are afraid, they talk. They talk to make sense of what they do not know. They talk to test rumours against other rumours. They talk because silence feels like being alone with the worst possibility. During the war, rumours moved quickly. A ship had gone down, a division had shipped out, a plant was producing something secret. A local boy had been seen in a newsreel. A town was going to be attacked. A convoy was leaving. A certain factory would be sabotaged. Some rumours were nonsense. Some had a grain of truth. Some were repeated because they made people feel informed. Some were repeated because a person wanted attention. All of them created work for officials who understood that bad information could be harmful in more than one way. The government worried about rumour not only because rumour might reveal truth, but because rumour could damage morale. A false story about a defeat could spread fear. A false story about shortages could cause hoarding. A false story about enemy agents could inflame suspicion against neighbours. A false story about a local disaster could create panic. The Office of War Information and other agencies tried to guide public understanding, while the Office of Censorship worked to prevent sensitive details from reaching the enemy. Newspapers, radio, newsreels, and magazines operated under wartime codes that limited what they should publish or broadcast. Much of this censorship was voluntary in the American press, which makes the system especially interesting. Editors were not always waiting for a censor to stand over them with a stamp. They were expected to censor themselves. That sounds gentler than direct government control, and in some ways it was. The United States did not abolish the press. Newspapers still criticised, argued, reported casualties, covered politics, and described the war. But self-censorship is still censorship. It requires people to internalise the boundary. Editors were told not to publish certain kinds of information unless it had been officially released. Troop movements, ship sailings, exact locations of military units, weather details that could help the enemy, production data, damage reports, and technical information all had to be treated carefully. Radio broadcasters had to avoid careless live remarks. Even the weather could become sensitive because weather affected military operations. Something as ordinary as saying fog had covered a harbour could matter if the wrong listener heard it. Think about a radio announcer in that world. He's used to speaking naturally, filling time, describing conditions, making conversation for listeners he cannot see. Now he has to remember that the microphone does not only reach families in living rooms, it can be monitored, it can be recorded, it can be studied. A casual comment about weather, shipping, troop trains, factory activity, or local defences might be more than colour. The announcer has to cut habits out of his own speech. He has to become less spontaneous in order to be safer. That is a difficult thing for any person whose work depends on words. Newspapers face the same tension. Readers wanted detail. Detail makes news feel real. A vague report is less satisfying than a precise one. People wanted to know where their men were, what units were involved, how much damage had been done, what ships had sailed, what factories were making, how far an army had advanced, and what weather might affect the next move. The military and censorship officials often wanted less detail, at least until the information no longer mattered tactically. This created a wartime bargain between the public's desire to know and the government's claim that some knowledge had to wait. For the ordinary reader, this meant learning to read official language. A report might say a unit was in the South Pacific, not exactly where. A battle might be described after a delay. A casualty list might arrive without the fuller context families desperately wanted. A newspaper might mention that war production was increasing without explaining everything made at the local plant. A person could feel informed and uninformed at the same time. That is one of the frustrations of wartime citizenship. You are asked to sacrifice for events you're not always allowed to understand fully while they're happening. Factories created another zone of careful speech. War plants were often surrounded by secrecy. Workers might know they were making aircraft parts, radios, weapons components, engines, explosives, ships, or specialised equipment. Some knew only their own small part of the process. They were warned not to discuss production numbers, design details, schedules, weaknesses, problems, or shipments. Signs at factory gates reminded them. Supervisors reminded them. Posters reminded them. A man could spend 10 hours doing war work and then be told not to talk too much about what he had done. A woman could be proud of her job in a defence plant and still have to describe it vaguely to relatives. That silence had a social cost. Work is one of the things people most naturally talk about. They complain about bosses, machines, hours, co-workers, pay, accidents, mistakes and achievements. In wartime plants, some of that ordinary talk became risky. A worker might still talk, of course. People always do. But the warning was there. Do not discuss what the plant produces. Do not mention delays. Do not mention shipments. Do not describe a technical problem to someone outside. Do not assume the person at the next table is only curious. The war asked workers to carry their labour home without carrying home its details. The same caution applied around transportation hubs. Train stations and bus depots were full of uniforms, families, workers, strangers and goodbyes. They were also places where information gathered naturally. Someone saw troops boarding. Someone noticed a unit passing through. Someone heard a destination. Someone recognised a symbol on a bag or vehicle. A mother saying farewell might hear things without meaning to. A porter might know more than he should repeat. A waitress in a station lunchroom might overhear soldiers talking. These places were alive with speech, and that made them sensitive. The enemy did not need every American to be a spy. The enemy only needed enough useful details to be collected from people who never thought of themselves as sources. That idea was frightening because it blurred the line between innocence and harm. Most careless talk was innocent in intention. A person repeating a rumour about a convoy was not trying to kill sailors. A factory worker boasting about output was not trying to aid the enemy. A parent telling neighbours where a son had shipped out was not betraying the country. But wartime security campaigns did not focus on intention. They focused on consequence. The posters were not asking whether you meant well. They were asking whether the words could travel. This could produce suspicion. If anyone might overhear, then anyone might be suspect. The stranger at the diner, the quiet man on the bus, the woman reading in the station, the customer at the next counter, the new worker at the plant, the boarder renting a room, all could become figures in the imagination. In reality, most of them were ordinary people minding their own business. But wartime propaganda often used the image of the hidden listener because it was effective. It gave silence a face. It made caution dramatic. It told civilians that spies did not always look like spies. Sometimes danger was simply a person close enough to hear. There is an uncomfortable side to that message. It helped protect information, but it also fed fear of neighbours, foreigners, immigrants, accents, political dissenters, and anyone who seemed different. During wartime, suspicion rarely falls evenly. German Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans, recent immigrants, labour activists, and people with unpopular opinions could all become objects of distrust. In the case of Japanese Americans, government suspicion became mass incarceration, a policy that stripped families of homes, businesses, freedom and dignity. That was not merely a matter of careless talk. It was a sweeping violation carried out under the language of military necessity. Any honest account of wartime restrictions has to remember that caution, fear, and prejudice can become entangled very quickly. Even for those not targeted in such severe ways, speech narrowed. People learned which opinions were safe to express and which ones would draw anger. Criticising the war too openly could be seen as disloyal, especially after Pearl Harbor. Complaining too much about rationing, taxes, shortages, or military decisions could earn a sharp response. Don't you know there's a war on? Did not only apply to gasoline and sugar, it applied to attitude. A person was expected to support the effort, to keep morale up, to avoid spreading defeatism, and to speak carefully about national setbacks. This did not mean everyone agreed all the time. Political debate continued, elections happened, newspapers argued. But in everyday social life, the pressure to sound loyal was real. Families felt this around the radio. The radio was the great wartime voice in the home. People gathered around it for news, speeches, entertainment, music, comedy, and official announcements. President Roosevelt's voice entered living rooms with a calm authority many Americans trusted. News broadcasters described distant places that listeners had never seen and might not have been able to locate easily on a map before the war. The radio made the war present, but it also controlled the pace of information. You heard what could be said. You waited for confirmation. You learned to distrust rumours until the radio or newspaper made them official, though people still repeated rumours anyway because waiting is hard. After a news broadcast, conversation often began. What does it mean? Is he safe? Where is that island? Did you hear from your brother? Do you think the Germans are finished? Are the Japanese closer than they say? Why are they not telling us more? The family might discuss these questions at the table, but even there caution could appear. A father might tell a child not to repeat something at school. A mother might fold a letter and put it away when visitors arrived. A neighbour might lower her voice before mentioning a ship. The house was private, but not entirely outside the war's demand for silence. Schools taught the lesson too. Children heard slogans. They saw posters. They were told not to repeat information about family members in the service. They learned that a secret was not only something exciting between friends, but something connected to ships and soldiers. A child might not understand the details, but he could understand the rule. Do not talk about where your brother is going. Do not say what your father's factory makes. Do not repeat what your mother read in a letter. This gave children a role in the home front, but it also placed adult seriousness on young shoulders. A child who loves to share news suddenly has to learn restraint. The telephone added another layer. Long-distance calls were expensive and limited by technology, and wartime communication systems were under pressure. People were also warned that telephone conversations could be insecure, especially when discussing military matters. The advice was simple: do not say sensitive things on the phone. For people used to treating the telephone as a private wire between two homes that required a change in imagination. The voice travelling through the line did not feel public, but wartime taught people to assume that communications could be intercepted, misunderstood, or repeated. Again, the lesson was not to become silent altogether. It was to treat information as something that could escape. There were moments when censorship became visible in a direct and personal way. A letter arrived with black marks or missing lines. A soldier complained that he could not say where he was. A newspaper left out details everyone wanted. A radio program avoided mentioning something that seemed obvious locally. A family heard that a reporter had waited to file a story until an operation was over. These moments reminded people that the war was being filtered. Most accepted this as necessary, but acceptance did not remove frustration. People wanted truth. They also wanted safety. The two did not always arrive at the same time. I want to pause with the person writing a letter at night. The house is quiet. The blackout curtains may already be drawn if the family lives where such rules apply. The table is cleared, the ration books are in the drawer, the car outside has only so much gasoline. Now a woman sits with paper in front of her, writing to a man overseas. She wants to sound cheerful, but not falsely cheerful. She wants to tell him about the children, the garden, the neighbour, the price of things, the trouble with shoes, the weak coffee, the weather, the small ordinary details that make home feel real. She also wants to ask where he is, what he is doing, whether he is frightened, whether he has enough to eat, whether he has seen terrible things, whether he will come home. She knows he cannot answer some of that. She may know her own letter could be read too. So she writes around the silence. She fills the page with safe love. Safe love is still love, but it has a different texture. It avoids certain names. It does not press too hard. It says everyone is fine even when everyone is not fine. It mentions the baby's tooth, the garden beans, the church supper, the neighbour's new job, the way the dog still waits at the door. It creates home without giving away anything useful. It tries to comfort without demanding information that cannot be given. Millions of letters like that crossed the war, and every one of them shows how careful speech did not only happen in public. It happened in the most intimate writing people did. For soldiers, the caution could be even more intense. They were trained not to reveal military information. They knew letters might be censored. They knew careless words could have consequences. Yet they also had to maintain emotional ties. A man might write, "I am somewhere in England," or "somewhere in the Pacific," or "I can't say much, but I'm all right." Those phrases became part of wartime family language. Somewhere, can't say, don't worry, I'm fine. Words chosen less for fullness than for permission. That is perhaps the deepest civilian experience of wartime speech, the constant awareness of permission. Can I say this? Can I repeat this? Can I publish this? Can I broadcast this? Can I ask this? Can I tell the children? Can I mention it at church? Can I write it in a letter? Can I say it on the telephone? Can I put it in the newspaper? Can I say what I know? Or must I carry it quietly? That awareness did not make every conversation grim. People still laughed, gossiped, flirted, told stories, complained, sang, prayed, and argued. But a boundary had been placed around certain words, and the boundary moved with the war. The strange thing is that many Americans became proud of that restraint. Silence could be patriotic. Not knowing could be patriotic. Waiting could be patriotic. A person who refused to repeat a rumour might feel he had done his part. A newspaper editor who held back a detail might believe he had helped protect men in uniform. A mother who kept her son's location vague at church might feel the ache of it, but also the discipline. The war made speech into a kind of rationed item. You did not spend it carelessly. Still, words leaked because people are people. They leaked in bars where workers relaxed after shifts. They leaked in letters written too quickly. They leaked in train cars full of uniforms. They leaked through pride, loneliness, boredom, anger and fear. Officials knew they could not seal every mouth. That is why the campaign was so constant. Posters had to repeat what people already knew, because knowing once was not enough. A tired person forgets. A proud person exaggerates. A frightened person seeks reassurance. A lonely person tells secrets to feel less alone. The home front was not made of perfect citizens. It was made of human beings trying to behave carefully under strain. By late evening, in thousands of houses, the day's word settled. The radio was off, the newspaper was folded, the letter was written or read again. Someone had said too much at supper and been corrected. Someone had heard a rumour and decided not to repeat it. Someone had blacked out a line in a letter before sending it, just to be safe. Someone had told a child, "That is not something we talk about outside." These are small moments, but they are the daily evidence of a nation learning that speech had joined sugar, gasoline, rubber, and light as something to be managed. The family in the kitchen still talks, of course. They talk about homework, bills, neighbours, the garden, the weather, when it is safe to mention it casually at home, and whether there will be enough meat for Sunday. They talk about ordinary things because ordinary talk is one of the ways a home remains a home. But certain subjects now have a quiet fence around them, a ship's name, a departure date, a factory detail. A location in a letter, a rumour from the station, a complaint that sounds too bitter, a fear that might frighten the children. The words are there, but not all of them are allowed to come out. And after the careful talk, after the radio voices and the folded letters and the warnings printed in bold letters on posters, the family still has to eat. The next morning will bring breakfast, lunch pails, school meals, factory shifts, shopping lists, and the old question that wartime asks in the plainest possible way: what can we make from what we have? Because food was not only something civilians were limited in buying. It was something they had to stretch, substitute, save, grow, preserve, and rethink until the entire American kitchen became another place where the war was counted out in spoonfuls, leftovers, garden rows, and meals planned carefully enough to last until tomorrow. The next morning begins in the kitchen, because for most families that is where the war kept returning no matter how far away the fighting was. Before anyone reads the newspaper properly, before the radio news has been discussed, before the children are fully awake, there is the old practical question that every household has to answer. What are we going to eat today? In peacetime, that question can still be tiring, but it usually belongs to appetite, money, habit, and time. During World War II, it belonged to all of those things, and also to stamps, points, shortages, government advice, military needs, shipping space, farm labour, food processing, and the quiet expectation that a responsible family would waste almost nothing. A wartime breakfast table in America did not usually look like starvation. That is important to say plainly. Most American civilians were not living through the kind of hunger experienced in occupied Europe or in bombed cities overseas. The United States remained a food-producing giant, and American farms fed civilians, soldiers, allies, and relief programs on an enormous scale. But abundance had been reorganised. That is the key. Food still existed, but it no longer arrived in the kitchen with the same ease, the same predictability, or the same private meaning. The bacon in the pan, the sugar in the bowl, the coffee in the pot, the canned peaches in the cupboard, the butter on the table, the meat for Sunday dinner, All of these had been pulled into the machinery of war. The person who felt that most directly was usually the woman planning the meals. She might be a mother, a wife, a grandmother, an older sister, a boarding house keeper, a widow, or a young woman living in a defence town with relatives and factory workers at the table. Whoever she was, the daily work of feeding people became a kind of arithmetic that did not stop. She had to know what was rationed, what was available, what could be substituted, what the family would actually eat, what could be packed for lunch, what could be reheated, what would spoil, what could be saved, what could be stretched, and what would have to wait. The war did not only change what was on the plate, it changed the way a person had to think before the plate was filled. That thinking often began with breakfast. Coffee, for a time, had to be stretched. Sugar had to be measured carefully. Butter might not be available in the quantity the family wanted. Bacon, if present, carried more meaning than it once had, because meat and fats were tied to rationing and salvage. The old casual habits around breakfast became less casual. A spoonful of sugar in coffee was not only taste, it was a deduction from the household supply. A second cup of coffee was not only comfort, it was part of a rationed habit. Toast with butter was not only toast, it was fat, dairy, points, and planning. A child asking for more jam might be asking for sugar that had been saved through weeks of decisions. This does not mean families became joyless about food. They still enjoyed eating. They still celebrated birthdays, holidays, homecomings, and small good news. They still tried to make Sunday feel different from Tuesday. People are remarkably determined to create normal life under abnormal conditions. But pleasure at the table had to be managed. A cake was no longer just a cake. It might represent saved sugar, an egg spared from another use, shortening that could have gone into biscuits, and perhaps cocoa or spices that were not as easy to replace as before. The person serving it might smile and say nothing about the calculation behind it, because part of good homemaking was making effort appear natural. But the calculation was there. Sugar remained one of the most constant lessons. It was not only for dessert. It was for preserving fruit, sweetening drinks, baking, breakfast, medicine, canning, and comfort. A household that had always kept sugar in a container near the stove now treated it with care. The scoop did not go in casually. Recipes were adjusted. Cakes used less. Cookies shrank. Frosting became thinner or disappeared. Homemakers learned to use molasses, honey, corn syrup, fruit, or other sweeteners when they could get them, though those too were not always simple solutions. Newspapers printed wartime recipes that promised flavour with less sugar, and government leaflets encouraged substitutions with the confident voice of people who did not have to listen to a disappointed child at the table. Home canning made sugar even more important. The government encouraged families to preserve food, especially from victory gardens, but preserving fruit often required sugar. A woman standing over peaches in late summer had to think months ahead. The fruit would not wait forever. If it spoiled, it was wasted. If it was canned properly, it could feed the family in winter. But canning without enough sugar could affect flavour and storage, depending on the method and the food. Families could sometimes apply for extra sugar for canning, which shows how deeply the government had entered the seasonal rhythm of the kitchen. Even jam had paperwork behind it. Meat required another kind of adjustment. American meals had often placed meat at the centre, especially when a family could afford it. Meat gave a meal weight. It made a table feel substantial. It satisfied men coming home from physical work, children growing fast, and anyone who had learned to judge a proper dinner by whether meat was present. During the war, meat did not vanish, but it had to be planned. Red points mattered, cuts mattered. Cheaper cuts, tougher cuts, organ meats, leftovers, bones, drippings, and small portions all became part of the strategy. A roast might appear less often, and when it did appear, its second and third lives mattered almost as much as the first. A roast could become sandwiches, hash, soup, gravy, or a filling stretched with potatoes, carrots, onions, rice, or noodles. Bones went into stock. Drippings were saved. Fat was never treated as something to scrape into the trash without thought. A small piece of meat could flavour a large pot of beans. Ground meat could be extended with breadcrumbs, oatmeal, cereal, or vegetables. Liver and other organ meats appeared in recipes promoted for nutrition and thrift, whether families welcomed them or endured them. Meatless meals, which might have once seemed like a sign that something was missing, were reframed as patriotic and practical. Beans, eggs, cheese when available, peanut butter, fish, and vegetable dishes moved into places where meat had once carried the meal. The language around this was often cheerful. Wartime cookbooks and newspaper columns did not usually say, "You cannot have what you want." They said things like, "Make it stretch, serve attractive meals, plan wisely, keep your family healthy, use leftovers creatively, and do your part." That cheerfulness could be useful. It gave women tools. It offered recipes and ideas. It made sacrifice feel less like deprivation. But it could also add pressure. A woman was not merely supposed to cope with shortages. She was supposed to do it well, with good nutrition, good morale, low waste, patriotism, and preferably a pleasant expression. This is where the wartime kitchen reveals a great deal about gender. Men certainly experienced food rationing. They ate the meals, stood in lines, read posters, saved grease, planted gardens, and sometimes cooked, especially if they were single, widowed, living in boarding houses, or away from family. But the day-to-day responsibility for stretching food usually fell on women. The government spoke to them directly as household managers. Posters, radio programs, pamphlets, and home economics. Experts addressed the housewife as a homefront soldier, a guardian of nutrition, a controller of waste, a planner of points, and a person whose competence could help win the war. This was praise, but it was also a burden. Being told that your work matters can be meaningful. Being told that every mistake is unpatriotic can be exhausting. Lunch brought its own problems. Men and women working in factories needed food that could be carried, eaten quickly, and give enough energy for long shifts. Children needed school lunches. Farmers needed meals that could go into fields. Office workers and shop clerks needed something practical. Meat shortages changed sandwiches. Butter and fats changed spreads. Sugar changed baked goods tucked into lunch pails. Wax paper, paper bags, jars, tins, and reusable containers became part of the routine. A lunch was not just assembled in the morning. It was designed from what had survived supper and what could be spared from tomorrow. Leftovers became central. That word can sound dull now, but during the war it was almost a principle of household management. Leftover potatoes became patties. Leftover vegetables became soup. Leftover bread became crumbs, stuffing, pudding, or thickening. Leftover meat became hash or filling. Even cooking water from vegetables could be saved for soup because vitamins and flavour had gone into it. A small amount of gravy could transform dry bread. A spoonful of bacon grease could season greens. Nothing was supposed to be looked at once and dismissed. The wartime cook had to see future meals hiding inside present scraps. That way of seeing takes practice. A tired person opens a refrigerator and sees small bowls of unappealing remains. A practiced wartime cook sees tomorrow's soup, a lunch filling, a casserole, a sauce, a way to stretch flour, a way to avoid spending points. This was not romantic thrift. It was work. It required memory, timing, and imagination under pressure. Food had to be safe, palatable, and nourishing. It had to satisfy people who were tired of being told to accept less. It had to fit the ration calendar. And it had to appear on the table again and again without making the household feel defeated. Victory gardens helped, but they were not effortless. The phrase can sound almost charming now, a victory garden. It suggests neat rows of tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce, peas, squash, and a family smiling in the sun. Some gardens probably did look like that on certain days, but gardens are not posters. Gardens require digging, planting, weeding, watering, thinning, pest control, harvesting, preserving, and learning from failure. A family that had never grown much food could discover very quickly that patriotism does not make soil fertile by itself. Seeds do not sprout because a poster tells them to. Beans still need poles. Tomatoes still split. Insects do not respect national emergencies. Still, millions of Americans planted. Backyards became vegetable plots. Vacant lots became community gardens. Schoolyards, factory grounds, parks, and suburban lawns produced food. Children helped. Elderly people who knew gardening from earlier years became valuable sources of advice. Neighbours shared seeds, tools, and complaints. A family could take real pride in eating beans grown behind the house, or tomatoes from a patch that had once been ornamental. The garden gave civilians a form of participation that felt direct. You put your hands in the dirt, and later there was food. That is a very different feeling from surrendering a ration stamp. It gave people agency. It also changed the household calendar. Spring meant preparation. Summer meant constant work. Late summer and autumn meant preserving. Canning jars had to be found, cleaned, and reused. Lids and rings mattered. Pressure canning required knowledge and care, especially for low-acid foods. Spoilage was not only wasteful, it could be dangerous. Kitchens became hot and humid during canning season, with pots boiling, windows open, children warned away from scalding water, and shelves slowly filling with jars. A successful row of canned tomatoes or green beans was not decoration. It was security. Each jar said the family had pushed a little food forward into the uncertain months ahead. The garden also changed what people ate because fresh vegetables could supplement rationed processed foods. If canned goods cost points, then fresh produce from the garden helped save them. If meat was limited, vegetables could give volume to soups, stews, casseroles, and lunches. If money was tight, the garden helped there too. There. The government encouraged this not only because it fed families, but because it reduced pressure on commercial agriculture and food processing. Every pound grown at home was one less pound that had to be grown, canned, shipped, and sold through strained systems. A backyard tomato did not need a freight car. For children, victory gardens could be both chore and adventure. A child might be proud of carrots pulled from the ground or bored by weeding in the heat. Schools encouraged participation. Youth organisations joined in. Some children learned practical skills that stayed with them for life. Others learned that patriotic work could involve blisters and mosquitoes. They heard adults say the garden helped soldiers, and that may have made the work feel important. But a child still knows when he would rather be playing. The home front often turned children into helpers before they had much say in the matter. The kitchen fat salvage campaign deserves a closer look because it is one of the most vivid examples of wartime food stretching beyond food itself. Housewives were told to save waste fats from cooking and take them to butchers. The fat could be processed for glycerin, which was used in explosives. A pan of drippings after frying bacon was no longer only a cooking byproduct, it was potential war material. This created one of the oddest bridges between the domestic and the military. A woman scraping grease into a can could be told she was helping make ammunition. The statement was practical, but it also carried propaganda power. It made the kitchen feel connected to the battlefield in a way no one could miss. At the same time, fat was useful in the kitchen. That created a small tension. Drippings could season food, enrich beans, fry potatoes, or replace other fats that were rationed. Turning in fat for salvage meant giving up something that might help stretch meals. Government campaigns had to persuade women to save what they could and surrender what was truly waste. But in a careful household, very little fat felt like waste. The line between saving for cooking and saving for explosives could be a real decision. Again, the war asked the housewife to judge. Nutritional advice became part of the public conversation. The government did not want rationing to make civilians weak or unhealthy. War workers needed strength. Children needed growth. Soldiers needed families at home to remain stable. The basic 7 food groups were promoted during the war as a guide for healthy eating, encouraging variety across vegetables, fruits, milk, meat, or alternatives, bread and cereals, butter or fortified margarine and other foods. The advice was sensible, but following it under rationing could be difficult. A chart can recommend milk, meat and vegetables. A mother still has to obtain them, afford them, cook them, and persuade children to eat them. Substitutions became part of everyday language. Margarine for butter, when available, syrup for sugar, beans for meat, powdered or canned milk where fresh milk was difficult, whole grain breads when white flour was less available, or when nutrition campaigns encouraged them, cottage cheese, peanut butter, eggs and legumes as protein sources. Some substitutions were accepted easily, others were disliked. Food habits are stubborn because they are tied to childhood, region, class, ethnicity, religion and family memory. A government pamphlet can tell a family to eat something different, but the table has its own history. Regional differences mattered. A farm family with chickens, a garden and storage space experienced food limits differently from an apartment family in a crowded city. A southern family might rely on beans, greens, cornbread, sweet potatoes, and pork traditions in ways that already stretched meat. A New England family might have different fish options. Italian-American, Jewish, Mexican-American, Polish-American, Black Southern, Appalachian, Scandinavian, and countless other food traditions shaped how rationing felt and how substitutions were made. There was no single American wartime meal. There were millions of tables adjusting through their own habits. Restaurants had to adapt too. Menus changed. Portions shifted. Certain foods appeared less often. Price controls and rationing affected what could be served. Diners, cafeterias, boarding houses, hotel restaurants, factory canteens and school lunch programs all operated within wartime conditions. A person eating away from home did not escape the war. The restaurant plate carried the same pressures as the family table, though differently arranged. A sign might apologise for limited choices. A waitress might explain that a favourite item was not available. Customers might grumble, and someone nearby might remind them that soldiers were eating from mess kits in the rain. Holidays tested the system. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, birthdays, weddings and homecomings all placed emotional demands on rationed food. A holiday meal is supposed to exceed the ordinary. That is part of its meaning. During wartime, exceeding the ordinary required saving. Sugar for pie, meat for a roast or turkey if available, butter for special baking, coffee for guests, canned fruit for dessert. A family might plan for weeks, saving stamps and points to create one meal that felt like before. The emotional value of that meal could be enormous. For one evening, the table might look close to normal, but everyone knew how much planning sat underneath it. There is a particular tenderness in a wartime birthday cake. It may be smaller than before. It may use less sugar, no frosting, a substitute fat, or a recipe clipped from a newspaper promising good results with fewer rationed ingredients. The child may notice the difference or may not. The mother certainly notices. She knows what she saved to make it. She knows what else those ingredients could have done. She lights the candles if candles are available and lets the child have the moment. The war does not vanish, but it is pushed aside just enough for a song. Food also carried memory of the men overseas. Families wondered what soldiers were eating. They read about K-rations, mess halls, field kitchens, powdered eggs, canned meat, coffee, and meals eaten cold or in mud or on ships. This knowledge made civilian complaints more complicated. A person at home might dislike meatless meals and weak coffee, but then imagine a son eating from a tin somewhere in North Africa or the Pacific. That comparison could silence complaint for a while, not forever, because civilian fatigue was real, but enough to make many people frame their own inconvenience as modest. The government encouraged that comparison. Posters and campaigns reminded civilians that soldiers needed the best food. The phrase, "so they'll have enough," captured the logic. Civilians were not simply eating less for no reason. They were leaving room in the national supply for the armed forces and allies. This was meant to produce pride, and often it did. But it also made the dinner table morally charged. Taking too much, wasting food, or cheating rationing could be framed as taking from soldiers. That is a powerful accusation to bring into a kitchen. Black markets challenged that moral order. Some people bought meat illegally or used ration stamps improperly. Some sellers held back goods. Some customers lied. Wherever goods are scarce and desire remains strong, illegal markets appear. The government condemned them because they undermined fairness. If one family stretched and saved while another bought extra through dishonest means, the whole idea of shared sacrifice weakened. People resented cheats not only because they broke rules, but because they made honest restraint feel foolish. Most households, though, lived in the ordinary middle ground. They were not perfect patriots and not criminals. They were people trying to get through the week. They saved leftovers most of the time. They complained sometimes. They planted gardens if they could. They tried recipes that did not always work. They stretched meat. They watered soup. They reused jars. They stood in lines. They celebrated when coffee rationing ended. They became irritated when a child wasted food. They learned which grocer was fair. They watched stamps disappear from ration books and hoped the month would not outlast the points. By evening, the results of all that planning appeared at the table. Maybe there was a casserole built from leftover vegetables and a little meat. Maybe bean soup with bread. Maybe macaroni with tomatoes from the garden. Maybe potatoes fried in saved drippings. Maybe a small piece of chicken stretched with gravy. Maybe no meat at all. The meal might be perfectly decent. It might even be good. But it was not casual. It carried the day inside it. The shopping, the stamps, the garden, the leftovers, the substitutions, the warnings about waste, the memory of shelves that didn't hold everything they once did. Someone at the table might ask for more. That request could be simple or difficult depending on the pot. The mother knows whether there is enough for tomorrow's lunch. She knows whether the leftovers are already planned. She knows whether the boy asking has been running all day and truly needs it. She knows whether the father will need a lunch pail packed before dawn. She knows whether the youngest has eaten enough. The serving spoon pauses for a moment over the dish. This is where rationing becomes intimate, not at the government office, not on the poster. Here, in the small decision of who receives the last spoonful, the family may still talk. They may discuss the radio news, the neighbour's garden, a letter from overseas, a school scrap drive, a factory shift, a blackout drill, or whether the car can be used later in the week. The table holds all the earlier rules at once. The food was rationed. The drive to buy it was limited. The kitchen light may need covering after dark. Certain news from letters cannot be repeated too freely. The war does not arrive as one burden, but as layers, each one ordinary enough to endure, all of them together changing the texture of home. After supper, the scraping begins. Plates are not scraped into the trash without thought. Bones are saved for stock, grease is saved, bread is wrapped, vegetables are covered. Coffee grounds may be stretched or composted. Jars are washed. The small remains of the meal are sorted into future possibilities. What can be used tomorrow? What can go into soup? What can be packed for lunch? What must not be wasted? The kitchen after a wartime meal is not only a place of cleaning, it is a place of recovery. The household gathers what the meal has left behind and turns it toward the next day. That is the meaning of stretching food until tomorrow. It was not one trick, one recipe, or one slogan. It was an entire way of thinking. Tomorrow was always present. Tomorrow's breakfast. Tomorrow's lunch pail. Tomorrow's points. Tomorrow's child asking for something sweet. Tomorrow's guest. Tomorrow's garden harvest. Tomorrow's news. The wartime kitchen lived slightly ahead of itself, because using too much today could make tomorrow harder. This required discipline, but also imagination. It required seeing a bone as broth, stale bread as pudding, grease as seasoning or salvage, garden beans as winter jars, and a small dessert as morale. The lights may be low now, the dishes may be drying, the ration book may be back in its drawer. A can of saved fat sits near the stove. In the pantry, jars from the garden line the shelf, each one the result of work that began months earlier in soil. The family has eaten, not extravagantly, not carelessly, but enough. And in a wartime home, enough was an achievement. It meant the meal had been planned, the points managed, the leftovers protected, the children fed, the workers prepared for another day, and the household kept steady for one more night. Yet food was only one part of what civilians had to stretch. The same logic moved through the rest of the house. If a can could be saved, so could a newspaper. If grease could be turned in, so could scrap metal. If shoes could be repaired, so could clothes. If a garden could serve the war, so could a pile of old rubber, a stack of magazines, a broken toy, a worn-out pot, a strip of cloth, or a tin can washed and flattened for collection. The war had taught Americans to look at their possessions differently. Nothing was merely old. Nothing was automatically useless. The house itself became a storehouse of materials the nation wanted back. The house itself became a place to search. That is one of the details that can be easy to miss if we only picture the home front as ration books, victory gardens, blackout curtains, and letters read beside the radio. By the middle of the war, Americans had been taught to look around their own homes with a different set of eyes. The old frying pan in the pantry was no longer only an old frying pan. The cracked rubber hose in the garage was no longer only something to throw away. A stack of newspapers was not clutter. A pile of rags was not useless. A bent lamp, a broken toy, a spare key, a worn tyre, a torn sheet, a bundle of magazines, a flattened tin can, a curtain too faded to hang in the window, all of these could be reclassified by wartime thinking. They became material. They became salvage. They became something the country wanted back. That word salvage has a plainness to it that suits the period. It does not sound grand. It does not sound like glory. It sounds like looking at what remains and deciding it still has value. During World War II, salvage drives asked civilians to do exactly that. The government and local committees told Americans to collect scrap metal, rubber, paper, rags, fats, rope, and other materials that might be reused in war production. Some of these materials were genuinely important to manufacturing. Some were more complicated in their actual economic impact than the posters suggested. But the public meaning was clear. Nothing useful should sit idle in a private home while the nation needed ships, guns, trucks, aircraft, uniforms, packaging, and ammunition. The request was practical, but it was also psychological. A person who could not fly a bomber, build a destroyer, or fight across Europe could still carry a bundle of scrap to a collection point. A child too young to enlist could pull a wagon full of old newspapers down the street. A woman already tired from cooking, working, rationing, and writing letters could still save rags and grease. A man with an old plough part behind the barn could drag it forward and say it was going into the war. Salvage turned the private household into a small mine. Not a mine in the earth, but a mine of leftovers, broken things, unused things, forgotten things, and objects that had quietly outlived their first purpose. Start with metal, because metal was the most visible. Metal has a satisfying weight in the hand. It clanks. It piles. It makes a heap that looks important. A scrap metal drive could transform a schoolyard, courthouse lawn, vacant lot, or gas station into a mountain of civilian offerings. Old bed frames, radiators, pots, pans, pipes, tools, fencing, farm equipment, license plates, hinges, stoves, iron toys, buckets, machinery parts, and sometimes things people probably regretted giving away later, all ended up in those piles. Children loved the drama of it. A boy pulling a wagon full of scrap did not have to imagine too hard that he was helping build something powerful. The pile itself made the idea visible. There is a sound to that scene. The scrape of metal against pavement, the bang of a pan tossed onto a heap, the rusty shriek of an old gate being dragged from a shed, men lifting something heavy from a truck bed, children shouting because their school is competing with another school to see who can collect more, a local official making a speech, a photographer from the newspaper arranging people beside the pile, a banner telling everyone to get in the scrap. The whole thing has the atmosphere of a community fair, except the prize is not a blue ribbon for jam or a calf. The prize is participation in war production. For children, scrap drives were one of the clearest ways to feel useful. A child could not fully understand steel production, shipping shortages, industrial logistics, or the chemistry of alloys. But a child could understand that metal was needed. He could knock on doors. He could ask neighbours if they had anything to give. He could search alleys, barns, cellars and garages. He could bring in a pile and hear an adult say good job. Schools used that energy. Classes competed. Teachers explained the war effort. Students collected tin cans, paper, rubber and scrap metal with a seriousness that adults often encouraged. The schoolyard salvage pile became a lesson in citizenship that did not require a textbook. But the household search was not always simple. Some objects were easy to give up because they were already broken, rusted or forgotten. Others carried memory. An old iron bed might have belonged to a grandmother. A brass doorknob might have come from a family house. A metal toy might be outgrown but not unloved. Pots and pans were especially personal because they belonged to the daily work of feeding people. There were stories of people donating things that had sentimental value because the emotional pressure was strong. A church bell, a fence, a family heirloom, a decorative object, all could become candidates for patriotic surrender. Not every donation was wise. Not every piece of metal was equally useful. But the act itself mattered to people because it turned sacrifice into something you could hold, carry and release. That release could be emotional. Giving an object away for scrap was different from throwing it out. Throwing it out says the object is done. Giving it to the war says its usefulness continues somewhere beyond your sight. A broken kettle might become, in public imagination at least, part of a tank or a ship or a gun. The exact path from household scrap to finished weapon was rarely as direct as posters implied, but the symbolic path was powerful. The old thing left your house, passed through the community pile, entered the vast machinery of collection and processing, and became part of the national effort. That was enough for many people. They did not need to see the furnace. Tin cans created a more regular routine. The can had to be cleaned, the paper label removed, the end sometimes tucked inside, and the whole thing flattened. This turned kitchen waste into a small industrial preparation task. A woman opening canned tomatoes or beans did not simply empty the can and discard it. She might rinse it, step on it, flatten it properly, and put it with the others for collection. A child might be given that job. There is something very wartime about a child standing in a kitchen, crushing cans underfoot because someone has explained that the metal matters. The sound is sharp and ordinary. It is not battle, but it belongs to the same system. Paper was another material people were told to save. Today we're used to recycling bins, but wartime paper salvage carried a different emotional charge. Newspapers, magazines, cardboard boxes, wrapping paper, cartons, office paper, and school papers could all be gathered. Paper was needed for packaging, shipping, communication, training materials, ammunition containers, and countless wartime uses. A stack of newspapers in the corner became more than old news. It became part of a supply chain. Families tied bundles with string. Children hauled them. Community groups collected them. Paper drives became regular events, sometimes with impressive totals printed in local papers to encourage pride and competition. Paper also represented memory, and this made it complicated. Newspapers carried war news. A family might keep an issue that announced a battle, a death, a victory, or a son's unit mentioned in print. Magazines brought photographs, stories, recipes, advice, fashion and distraction. Letters were not meant for salvage, of course, but the wartime home was full of paper that had to be sorted by emotional value. What can go? What must stay? The old magazines can be bundled, but not that newspaper. The cardboard can go, but not the letter. The school papers can go unless the child protests. Salvage asked people to distinguish between clutter and memory under the pressure of patriotism. Rubber was more urgent and more difficult. Metal had domestic drama. Paper had volume, but rubber had scarcity behind it. The loss of access to major natural rubber supplies in Asia made rubber one of the great material anxieties of the war. Tyres were already rationed and guarded through gasoline limits and speed restrictions. But beyond tyres, homes contained many small rubber objects: garden hoses, bathing caps, rubber boots, raincoats, hot water bottles, jar rings, floor mats, rubber toys, old inner tubes, overshoes, elastic and countless bits of household convenience. People were encouraged to bring in scrap rubber. Service stations became collection points. Children searched garages and sheds. A worn-out tyre that once would have been nothing but a nuisance became an object of national attention. There is a particular sadness in old rubber. Metal can look dignified even when it is rusty. Paper can be neatly bundled. Rubber often looks tired. It cracks. It smells. It sags. It sits in garages and sheds as if waiting for someone to admit it is useless. During the war, even that tired material was called back into service. A boy might roll an old tyre down the street toward a collection point, not because it could carry a car anymore, but because it still contained something the nation needed. Rubber salvage made people understand that modern life had depended on materials they rarely thought about. The soft grip, the waterproof seal, the flexible hose, the tyre under the car, the elastic in clothing, the soles of shoes, all of these were part of a global supply system that war had broken open. The rubber shortage also changed how people treated what they still had. A garden hose was not dragged carelessly over sharp stones. Tyres were checked and rotated, rubber boots were patched, elastic was used sparingly. Children were told not to ruin things. A household with old habits of casual replacement had to become careful. In that sense, salvage was not only about giving things up, it was about teaching a new relationship to objects. Use them longer, repair them sooner, save the pieces. Do not assume another one is waiting in a store. Cloth and clothing brought the issue even closer to the body. Fabric is intimate. It touches skin. It carries smell, shape, labour, modesty, identity, and class. During the war, cotton, wool, silk, nylon, rayon, leather, and other materials were pulled toward military production. Soldiers needed uniforms, blankets, tents, parachutes, webbing, bandages, packs, and equipment. Civilians still needed clothing, but the way clothing was made and bought changed. In the United States, clothing was not rationed through personal coupon books in the same sweeping way as in Britain, but production was restricted. Fabric use was limited. Designers were told what they could not do. Excess became suspect. Women's clothing especially came under detailed regulation. Skirts could not use unlimited fabric. Full sleeves, deep pleats, large cuffs, extra pockets, attached hoods, wide belts, and other features were restricted or banned in many garments. The point was to conserve cloth and prevent fashion changes that would make women feel their old clothing was outdated. That is a very revealing wartime idea. The government was not only trying to save fabric from each dress, it was trying to slow desire. Fashion depends on change. War wanted usefulness, durability, and restraint. A skirt should not become obsolete just because a new style demanded more cloth. The war had no patience for fashion's appetite. For men, suits changed too. Cuffs disappeared from trousers. Vests became less common. Double-breasted suits and extra pairs of pants were discouraged or restricted in various ways. The so-called victory suit used less fabric and simplified style. A man might not think of his cuffs as a military matter, but the War Production Board did. A cuff was fabric, a wide lapel was fabric, an extra pair of trousers was fabric. Multiply that fabric by millions of garments, and the waste becomes visible to planners. The civilian body dressed for work, church, office, school, or a night out had become part of material conservation. That does not mean Americans stopped caring how they looked. They cared very much. Women adjusted creatively. Hemlines, hats, hairstyles, lipstick, and accessories carried new importance. If fabric was limited, style moved elsewhere. A simple dress could still be neat. A repaired suit could still be pressed. A woman working in a factory could still take pride in her appearance. A teenager could still want something fashionable. Wartime clothing rules did not erase vanity, self-respect, or the human wish to look alive in difficult times. They redirected them. People learned to make do without looking as if they had given up. Nylon stockings became one of the most famous examples. Before the war, nylon stockings had been a modern wonder, strong, smooth, and desirable. Then nylon was needed for parachutes, cords, and military uses, and civilian stockings disappeared from ordinary availability. Women saved old pairs, mended runs, painted seams on their legs, used leg makeup, or went bare-legged when weather and social expectations allowed. Silk stockings were also drawn into the war effort, and old stockings could be collected. Something as delicate as hosiery became tied to aircraft and parachutes. The connection is almost too direct to miss. What once covered a civilian leg could become part of a system meant to lower a soldier from the sky. There is a small but telling scene in that. A woman stands in a bedroom before work or church, looking at her legs in the mirror. Before the war, she might have reached for stockings without much thought if she could afford them. Now she checks whether the old pair can survive one more wearing. A run has to be stopped. A seam has to be straightened or drawn. She may be annoyed by the inconvenience, but she also knows the reason. Nylon is not missing because the store failed. It is missing because the war has taken it. The absence is worn on the body. Rags were collected too. Old clothing that could not be repaired, worn sheets, torn towels, fabric scraps, and household textiles could be saved for industrial use. But cloth also had to be conserved at home. Mending became more important. A shirt with a frayed collar was turned, patched, or cut down. Children's clothes were handed down, altered, lengthened when possible, or remade. A woman might take apart an adult garment and turn it into clothing for a child. Feed sacks, depending on the household and region, could become aprons, dresses, curtains, or quilts. Nothing about this was entirely new. Many families had lived through the Depression and already knew how to stretch cloth. The war gave that old thrift a public purpose. The mending basket, like the ration book, became part of wartime management. Buttons were saved, zippers were reused, thread mattered, a good needle mattered. A patch was not a sign of failure if done neatly. Shoes were repaired, polished, and protected, coats lasted. Sweaters were darned, socks were mended. The closet became a place of strategy. What can be made to last another season? What can be let down for a growing child? What can be dyed? What can be recut? What can be sacrificed for rags? The domestic labour of clothing care, often invisible in peacetime, became another form of conservation. There is something important here about the difference between giving up and making do. Giving up suggests loss only. Making do suggests activity. The wartime household was not simply deprived of materials, it was asked to act on scarcity to turn it into skill. Save the paper, flatten the cans, bring in the rubber, mend the sock, reuse the jar, turn in the fat, cut down the dress, repair the toy, patch the hose, tie the newspapers, sort the scrap. These are verbs. They fill the day. They made people feel that scarcity could be answered with work, and work there was. Salvage did not happen by magic. Someone had to collect, sort, clean, carry, store, and deliver the materials. The government could print posters, but the housewife had to rinse the can. The child had to pull the wagon. The school had to organise the drive. The local committee had to arrange pickup. The junk dealer had to weigh and move the pile. The factory had to process what was useful. The entire system depended on thousands of small actions repeated in ordinary places. A salvage pile was a public object built out of private chores. Local salvage committees became part of community life. They organised drives, printed notices, worked with schools, churches, clubs, businesses and newspapers. They set goals. They celebrated totals. They reminded people that the need was ongoing. A single collection did not end the obligation. The war kept consuming materials, so the home had to keep producing salvage. People could grow tired of being asked. At first, a drive might feel exciting. Later, it could feel like another demand in a year already full of demands. But repeated reminders kept the habit alive. Newspapers helped. They printed lists of what to save, where to bring it, how much had been collected, which school or neighbourhood led the effort, and why more was needed. Local pride became a tool. If the next town collected more scrap, that mattered. If a school reached its goal, students felt proud. If a county lagged behind, officials could shame it gently, or not so gently. Wartime mobilization worked best when national need became local competition. People may sacrifice for country, but they will also work very hard not to be outdone by the town down the road. Scrap drives could also reveal the messy side of patriotism. Not every person involved was noble. Some people stole materials, some dealers cheated. Some drives produced piles that were not as useful as advertised. Some objects were collected mainly for morale. There were debates among historians later about how much certain salvage drives actually added to industrial supply compared with normal scrap markets. That is worth knowing because it keeps the story honest. The home front was not a perfect machine. It included exaggeration, waste, confusion, publicity, corruption, and symbolic acts that may have mattered more to morale than to production. But symbolic acts are not nothing in wartime. A government fighting a global war needs ships and steel, but it also needs civilians to believe they are included. Salvage drives did that. They gave people a ritual of contribution. They turned barns, attics, kitchens, schoolrooms and garages into places where the war could be served. Even if the old saucepan did not literally become part of a bomber, the person who surrendered it may have felt more connected to the bomber's crew. That feeling helped sustain morale. It also helped enforce the broader ethic of conservation. Do not waste. Do not hoard useless things. Do not leave materials idle. The nation needs them. For farm families, scrap metal had particular meaning because farms accumulate metal over time. Old machinery parts, broken ploughs, chains, wire, gates, horseshoes, tools, and equipment might sit behind barns for years. Some of it might someday be useful. Farmers are often reluctant to discard things because a broken part can become a repair later. Wartime scrap drives challenged that habit. What should stay because it may be needed on the farm? What should go because the war needs metal now? This was not always an easy decision. Giving up the wrong piece might cause trouble later when replacement parts were hard to find. The government's hunger for material met the farmer's instinct for preparedness. In cities, the search looked different. Apartment dwellers had less space but still found paper, rags, tin cans, old keys, broken household goods and worn rubber items. Children searched alleys and basements. Building superintendents, shopkeepers, clubs and churches coordinated collections. A city salvage drive could produce astonishing piles because density has its own abundance. Thousands of small households, each contributing a little, could create volume quickly. A single family's bundle of paper was modest. A block's worth of bundles became impressive. The act of giving up objects also changed the emotional landscape of the home. Possessions that had sat quietly for years suddenly had to justify themselves. Why is this here? Will we use it again? Can it serve the war? Is keeping it selfish? That question could move through closets and attics with surprising force. People who had saved things from habit now saved with a different intention. Some things were saved for repair. some for salvage, some for memory. The line between them mattered. There was also the problem of children wanting to give away everything. A child caught up in a drive might look at the household with alarming enthusiasm. Could this go? What about this? Do we need this pan? What about Grandpa's old tools? Adults had to manage patriotic zeal with practical sense. The war encouraged children to search for scrap, but the household still had to function. A mother might be proud of her child's eagerness while also rescuing a perfectly good cooking pot from the salvage pile. Patriotism, in the hands of children, can be wonderfully literal. The drives created small ceremonies of surrender. A person carried something to a collection point and let it go. There might be a receipt, a weighing, a cheer, a notice in the paper, or simply the clang of the object joining the pile. The object left private life and entered public purpose. This was especially powerful when the item had been visible in the home. The missing pot, the absent gate, the cleared stack of magazines, the empty corner where old tyres had been, all became reminders that the household had contributed. Absence itself became patriotic decoration. Clothing conservation created a quieter absence. It showed not in piles but in simpler garments, repaired seams, fewer new purchases, narrower skirts, missing cuffs, and stockings that were not there. The body carried the evidence of material saving into public. A man at church in a suit without cuffs, a woman in a dress cut with less fullness, a girl wearing a remade coat, a boy in patched trousers, all were part of the same material story. They were not necessarily poor. They were wartime civilians wearing the restrictions of the period. Fashion adapted with ingenuity. Shorter jackets, slimmer skirts, simple lines, practical shoes and creative hats all became part of the look. Hats were often less restricted because they used less critical material, so they could become expressive. A woman who could not buy a lavish new dress might still refresh an outfit with a hat, a scarf, a pin, or careful grooming. Lipstick remained important for many women, including those in factory work, because morale and appearance were tied together in public messages about femininity and patriotism. The war limited fabric, but it did not remove the human need for dignity. That word dignity matters. Conservation can easily be described as doing without, but people still wanted to feel presentable. A patched garment could be dignified if clean and well repaired. A simple dress could be dignified if fitted carefully. A worn coat could be dignified if brushed and mended. The wartime household placed great value on care because care was the difference between poverty and thrift, between looking neglected and looking disciplined. To make something last required attention. That attention was another form of labour. By evening, after dinner has been stretched and the dishes have been cleared, the salvage work might still be visible. Newspapers tied in bundles near the back door, cans rinsed and flattened, a jar of saved fat waiting to go to the butcher, rags folded in a box, a child's wagon leaning against the wall, ready for Saturday's drive, an old tyre already loaded in the garage, a mending basket beside a chair, a suit brushed for another wearing, a dress waiting for repair. The war did not need to shout in that room. It had organised the corners. There is a kind of mental training in all of this. Before the war, a broken object might invite replacement. During the war, it invited a sequence of questions. Can it be repaired? Can it be reused? Can part of it be saved? Can it be donated? Can it become something else? That sequence changed people. It slowed disposal. It made waste visible. It reminded Americans that modern convenience depended on raw materials moving through global networks, and that those networks could be interrupted by war. The household learned, sometimes reluctantly, that abundance was not a permanent law of nature. The older generation may have recognised this more readily. People who had lived through earlier scarcity, farm life, immigrant thrift, or the Depression already knew how to reuse and repair. For them, wartime conservation may have felt like old habits given a new patriotic name. Younger people, especially those growing up in more consumer-oriented settings, learned a lesson that would stay with them. Some would carry it for decades, saving string, jars, foil, paper bags, buttons and screws long after the war ended. Their children and grandchildren would sometimes laugh at this habit, without realizing that it came from a time when throwing away a useful thing could feel morally wrong. That is one of the long shadows of the home front. The rules ended, but habits remained. People who had counted sugar, saved fat, patched clothing and bundled paper did not always return instantly to casual waste. Some did, especially as post-war abundance grew. But others kept the older reflex: use it up, wear it out, make it do without. The phrase sounds tidy, almost decorative now, printed on signs in antique shops. But in the 1940s it was not decoration. It was a working instruction. The emotional cost should not be ignored. Constant conservation can become tiring. It asks for attention even when a person wants rest. It turns the home into a place of responsibility rather than simple comfort. The housewife who saves cans, plans meals, mends clothes, stretches ration points, turns in fat, watches children, writes letters, tends a garden, and possibly works outside the home is not living in a charming poster. She is working. The father checking tyres, repairing appliances, giving up drives, sorting metal, and adjusting to fewer new goods is working too. The children collecting scrap are learning participation, but they are also learning that war reaches their toys, their shoes, their school day, and their sense of what belongs to them. Still, there was pride. People remembered salvage drives fondly because they were communal. They remember wagons full of scrap, school competitions, neighbours working together, and the feeling that even a child could help. That pride is real. It deserves to stand beside the fatigue. The home front was made of both. People were proud and tired, generous and annoyed, careful and careless, honest and sometimes tempted. They gave up objects and kept others hidden. They believed and complained. That mixture is what makes the history human. Late at night, the house settles. The paper bundle waits by the door. The kitchen fat has cooled in its can. The mended sock lies across the arm of a chair. The old magazines are gone from the corner because the school collected them that afternoon. A child is asleep, perhaps satisfied that his wagon carried more rubber than the boy next door's. In the garage there is more space where useless things used to be. In the closet, garments hang that will have to last. In the drawer, buttons and scraps are saved because no one knows when they may be needed. The family has given up metal, rubber, paper, cloth, fat, time, convenience, and a certain old carelessness. What remains is not emptiness exactly. It is a new order. The household has been rearranged around usefulness. Objects have become accountable. Waste has become visible. Even the quiet things in drawers and cupboards seem to belong partly to the nation now. And once that way of thinking enters a home, it does not stop at the salvage pile. It changes the habits of the people inside it, the way they shop, repair, save, plan, speak, travel, eat, dress, light a room, and imagine their own private lives. By then, the war has done something larger than limit purchases or collect scrap. It has changed what home itself is allowed to be. By the time a family had learned to save metal, flatten cans, stretch food, dim lights, watch gasoline, mend clothing, and speak carefully in public places, the war had done something deeper than create a list of restrictions. It had changed the meaning of home. That is easy to miss because each rule by itself can sound temporary. A ration book can be put away. A blackout curtain can be folded and stored. A scrap pile can be hauled off. A victory garden can be turned back into lawn. A windshield sticker can be scraped away. A speed limit can be lifted. A poster can be taken down from the post office wall. But habits do not leave as quickly as paper does. People who spend years measuring, saving, checking, waiting, and explaining themselves do not simply return to the old way of living the moment a war ends. For American civilians, World War II turned the private household into a public instrument. The kitchen was not only a kitchen, it was a place where food policy had to be obeyed. The pantry was not only a pantry, it was where ration stamps became meals. The garage was not only a garage, it was where rubber, gasoline and tyre pressure became national concerns. The window was not only a window, it was something that might have to be covered for the safety of ships offshore. The closet was not only a closet, it was a place where cloth had to be conserved, shoes repaired, buttons saved and old garments made useful again. The family conversation was not only conversation, it had to avoid certain details, certain rumours, certain names of ships or places or departures. Even silence became part of the war effort. That is a remarkable thing to happen inside a democracy. No single rule explains it. The change came through repetition. A person did not wake up one morning and say, "My home is now connected to every battlefield in the world." Instead, the connection was taught slowly. Save that grease. Turn out that light. Do not drive unless you need to. Bring your ration book. Do not waste sugar. Do not talk about troop movements. Do not throw away the paper. Patch those shoes. Plant vegetables. Keep the curtains closed. Buy bonds. Share rides. Stand in line. Make it last. The sentences were small, but they arrived so often that they built a new kind of civilian life. Before the war, the American home had already been shaped by hardship. The Great Depression had taught millions of families how quickly comfort could vanish. Many people entered the 1940s already knowing how to stretch a meal, repair a coat, save jars, and think twice before throwing anything away. But the Depression and the war taught different emotional lessons. During the Depression, going without often felt like a sign that the system had failed you. During the war, going without was described as service. That mattered. It changed the story people told themselves. A patched pair of shoes, a meatless meal, a smaller cake, a saved can of fat, a dimmed porch light, a cancelled Sunday drive. All of these could be placed inside a larger purpose. The inconvenience was real, but it was given a reason. Still, a reason is not the same as comfort. People were tired. That has to be said clearly. They were tired of waiting in lines, tired of weak coffee, tired of saving stamps, tired of being told to smile while doing without, tired of listening to speeches, tired of reading casualty lists, tired of guessing what was happening overseas, tired of children asking for things that could not be bought, tired of explaining that the old shoes had to last a little longer, tired of being cheerful because morale itself had become a duty. The home front is often remembered through posters, and posters are designed to make effort look clean. Actual homes were messier. There were arguments, resentments, mistakes, selfish moments, black market temptations, unfair advantages, quiet grief, and ordinary exhaustion. A mother might support the war completely and still snap at a child over wasted sugar. A father might agree with gasoline rationing and still feel trapped by the limits on driving. A teenager might understand that soldiers needed rubber and still hate the way the family car sat unused. A grocer might believe in rationing and still dread telling another customer no. A war worker might keep secrets and still wish he could talk openly about what he did all day. People can believe in a cause and be worn down by it at the same time. That is not hypocrisy. That is how long emergencies feel when they settle into daily life. The quiet rules also changed how people saw the federal government. Before the war, Washington could feel distant to many families, even after the New Deal had already expanded its presence during the 1930s. During the war, the government reached into the smallest transactions of civilian life. It told people how much they could buy, how much they could charge, how fast they should drive, what they should save, how they should use materials, and sometimes what information should remain unsaid. Local ration boards, price controls, draft boards, civil defense officials, war bond campaigns, factory regulations and federal agencies made national authority visible in towns, neighborhoods, stores, and kitchens. For some Americans, this felt necessary and even reassuring. For others, It felt intrusive. For most, it was probably both. The ration board is worth thinking about one last time because it shows how national power became local. A person applying for extra gasoline, tyres, fuel oil, or other restricted goods might not face a faceless machine in Washington. He might face people from his own area, people who knew the roads, jobs, distances, farms, factories, and sometimes the reputations of those asking. That made the system practical, but it also made it personal. A farmer, doctor, salesman, minister, or war worker could explain need and hope to be believed. A person suspected of exaggerating might face suspicion from neighbours. The war did not abolish local judgment, it used it. That local judgment could bring communities together. It could also create bitterness. Shared sacrifice sounds simple until people begin asking whether the sharing is fair. Why does one person get more gasoline? Why does one family seem to have more meat? Why does one neighbour still drive often? Why did that store have goods for certain customers and not others? Why is one woman able to make a cake when another cannot? Why is one man's business considered essential while another's is not? War creates unity, but it also sharpens comparison. When everyone is told to give something up, everyone starts noticing who appears to be giving up less. After the war, some of these tensions faded as goods returned. Factories shifted back towards civilian production. New cars eventually appeared again. Tyres became easier to replace. Meat, butter, coffee, shoes, nylon stockings, appliances, and countless other products returned to stores. But return did not happen overnight. People had waited for years, and demand built up behind the restrictions like water behind a dam. When the war ended, Americans did not simply step into instant abundance. Some shortages continued. Sugar rationing lasted well beyond VJ Day, a detail that must have felt especially frustrating to families who thought victory would immediately restore sweetness to the table. Peace came before all the old comforts did. The return of goods changed the mood of the home, but it also revealed how much desire had been stored up. People wanted cars, houses, refrigerators, washing machines, furniture, clothing, travel, gasoline, shoes, appliances, meat, butter, and the freedom to buy without explaining themselves. The post-war consumer boom did not come from nowhere. It came partly from years of restraint. After being told to repair, save, stretch, and wait, millions of Americans were ready to purchase, replace, expand, and modernize. The bright kitchen of the 1950s, with its appliances, packaged foods, suburban houses, and full refrigerators, was built partly on the memory of the wartime kitchen, where every spoonful of sugar had been counted. But not everyone entered that post-war world equally. That has to remain in the story. For many white middle-class families, the years after the war brought home loans, college benefits, new neighborhoods, stable jobs, and rising consumer comfort. For many Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and other communities, access to those benefits was limited by segregation, discrimination, local policy, violence, and unequal enforcement. The war had spoken often of democracy and shared sacrifice, but the home front had never been equally free for everyone. Black Americans serving in uniform or working in defense industries still faced segregation. Mexican American workers and families face discrimination even as wartime labor needs reshaped communities. Native people served and worked while continuing to confront federal policies that had long limited their rights and resources. The rules of the home front did not fall on a country that was already fair. For Japanese Americans, the phrase "quiet rules is not enough." Their experience was not only rationing, salvage, blackouts, or careful speech. It was forced removal and incarceration. Families were told to leave homes, farms, shops, fishing boats, schools, churches, neighborhoods, and possessions behind. Many had only days or weeks to prepare. They sold property at losses, stored what they could, carried what they were allowed, and entered camps surrounded by fences and guard towers. Many were American citizens. Their absence from the ordinary home front story is itself a warning. A government that asks civilians to sacrifice can also ask the public to accept injustice when fear and prejudice are strong enough. The war changed home forever for them in the most direct way. Home was taken. When the war ended, Japanese American families did not simply return to untouched lives. Some homes were gone. Businesses had been lost. Farms had been taken over or sold. Communities had changed. Property had vanished. Trust had been broken. The rules that governed their lives during the war were not minor inconveniences. They were violations of civil liberty that lasted far beyond the closing of the camps. Any honest account of what American civilians were not allowed to do has to hold that truth beside the more familiar images of ration books and victory gardens. Some civilians were not allowed to remain where they lived. Some were not allowed to keep the ordinary security of home. For millions of women, the war also changed home by changing work. Women entered defence plants, offices, transportation, military auxiliary services, volunteer roles, farms, hospitals, and countless jobs that had previously been closed to them or discouraged. They worked welding, riveting, inspecting, typing, nursing, driving, organising, teaching, managing, and producing. At the same time, many still carried the household work of rationing, cooking, mending, childcare, and emotional support. This double burden could be enormous. During the war, public messages praised women's work because the nation needed it. After the war, many women were encouraged or pressured to leave jobs for returning servicemen and return to domestic roles. But experience cannot be completely erased. A woman who has earned wages in a war plant, handled machinery, joined a union, managed a household under rationing, and kept a family running through years of strain does not become exactly who she was before. Some women did leave paid work and wanted to. Others left because they had little choice. Some stayed. Some remembered the war years as hard but expanding. Others remembered them as exhausting. The important thing is that the boundary between home and work had shifted. The wartime home was not a sealed domestic space. It was connected to factories, government offices, volunteer committees, ration boards, schools, military bases, and letters from overseas. Women stood at the centre of that connection, in ways that were often praised publicly, but still undervalued privately. The war made their labour visible for a time, but not visible enough. Children carried the war forward too. A child who learned to save paper, collect scrap, plant beans, sit through blackout drills, hear casualty news, and watch adults handle ration books grew up with a specific understanding of citizenship. Citizenship was not only voting or saluting the flag, it was saving, obeying, giving up, keeping quiet, and doing small tasks because adults said they mattered. Some children found pride in this, others absorbed anxiety. Many carried memories of shortages and salvage drives for the rest of their lives. Later, when they saved string, reused jars, guarded leftovers, or hated waste, they were not simply being eccentric. They were remembering a world in which waste had been treated as a failure of duty. The home itself kept traces. A blackout curtain stored in a closet. A ration book saved in a drawer as a curiosity. A bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, some words missing or vague because they could not be written plainly. A photograph of a woman in work clothes outside a plant. A victory garden patch that later returned to grass. A recipe clipped from a newspaper that used less sugar. A mended quilt made from old clothes. A war bond tucked away. A uniform in a trunk. A kitchen tool that survived because no replacement had been available. These objects became family history not because they were rare, but because they carried the feel of the rules. That is one of the reasons the home front still holds people's attention. It is made of objects we recognise. A shoe, a can, a curtain, a letter, a garden row, a tyre, a coffee cup, a grocery list, a light switch. These are not distant artefacts behind museum glass, even when museums preserve them. They are versions of things still around us. That makes the restrictions easier to feel. You do not have to imagine a battlefield to understand the irritation of not being able to buy coffee. You do not have to know military strategy to understand the stress of planning meals from limited supplies. You do not have to study naval warfare to understand why a coastal family might feel uneasy covering windows at night. The war becomes visible through small familiar things. There is also a lesson in how quickly ordinary life can be reorganized. Before the war, Americans had habits. After Pearl Harbor and mobilization, those habits changed quickly. People registered for ration books, factories converted, civil defense groups formed, scrap drives began, women entered war jobs, children collected materials, drivers slowed down, families planted gardens. The speed of adjustment is striking. People complained, but they adjusted. That tells us something about human beings. We often think our habits are fixed until events force them to change. Then, after enough repetition, the changed habit becomes normal. That new normal did not feel new forever. At first, ration stamps were strange. Later they were routine. At first, blackout drills were alarming. Later they became familiar. At first, saving fat sounded odd. Later the can near the stove was just there. At first, a 35-mile-per-hour limit felt restrictive. Later drivers became used to watching the needle. People can normalise almost anything if it becomes part of the daily schedule. That ability is useful, but it can also be dangerous. It allows survival under pressure, and it can also make people accept rules they should question. World War II contains both sides of that truth. The quiet rules changed the relationship between comfort and conscience. Before the war, using a little extra gasoline, throwing away a can, buying new shoes, leaving lights on, or serving a larger piece of meat might have seemed like private choices. During the war, those choices were given moral weight. A person was asked to think beyond the household. Who needs this material? Who might suffer if we waste it? Who is fighting while we complain? That way of thinking can produce generosity and discipline. It can also produce guilt and judgment. Home became less carefree because home had to answer to the world. By the end of the war, victory brought relief, grief, celebration, and uncertainty all at once. People poured into streets when the news came. Church bells rang. Factories paused. Strangers embraced. Families cried for men who would return and men who would not. The rules began to loosen, but the dead did not come back. A full shelf could not replace a missing son. A new car could not erase years of waiting. A bright window could not undo the nights spent listening in darkness. Peace restored freedoms, but it did not restore time exactly as it had been. In the months and years that followed, Americans often tried to move forward quickly. That is understandable. They wanted houses, babies, jobs, schools, vacations, appliances, normal meals, and full stores. They wanted to stop measuring life through emergency. They wanted the private home to become private again. But the wartime household had shown that home was never fully separate from the larger world. Supply lines, government policy, prejudice, military need, labour, global trade, and public fear could all enter through the kitchen door. That knowledge remained even when people preferred not to name it. A person standing in a post-war grocery store seeing shelves fill again might feel something more than convenience. She might feel relief. She might buy sugar without presenting a stamp and remember when she could not. A man filling the car with gasoline might remember when every mile had to justify itself. A child who'd grown older might watch lights glowing freely along a street and remember when windows had to be covered. A woman putting on nylon stockings might remember painted seams. A family taking a Sunday drive might understand, perhaps without saying it, that the return of unnecessary movement was one of the small luxuries of peace. That may be the simplest way to understand what was lost and regained. The freedom to be unnecessary, to drive for no reason, to bake because you feel like it, to leave a light on because the room looks warmer that way, to buy shoes because the old ones look tired, not because they have completely failed. To speak without first checking whether a detail should remain hidden. To throw away a can without thinking of steel. To choose a meal based on appetite rather than points. Wartime stripped away much of that casual freedom. It forced people to ask whether ordinary wants were justified. Peace, when it came, allowed unnecessary things to return. But the memory of necessary living stayed with many of them. Some kept saving, some kept mending, some kept distrust of waste, some kept pride in what they had done, some kept resentment, some kept silence around painful experiences, some kept boxes of letters, some kept photographs, some kept ration books as proof that the strange rules had really happened, and some kept wounds that were not visible in the nostalgic version of the home front, especially those whose rights had been denied in the name of security. So when we ask what American civilians were not allowed to do during World War II, the answer is not only a list. They were not allowed to buy freely, drive freely, shine lights freely, waste freely, speak carelessly, or treat household materials as theirs alone. Some were not allowed to stay in their homes at all. But beneath all of that is a larger answer. They were not allowed to live as if their private lives had no connection to the war. The government, the military, the economy, the neighbourhood, and the moral pressure of sacrifice all entered the house and rearranged it. Picture that house one last time. The ration book is still in the drawer, though the stamps are nearly finished. The curtains hang heavy over the windows. The car outside has worn tyres and a windshield sticker. In the pantry, jars from the garden sit beside carefully used sugar. Near the stove, a can for saved fat waits to be taken in. A mending basket rests beside a chair. Newspapers are tied near the door. A letter from overseas lies folded on the table, read so many times that the creases are soft. The radio is quiet for the moment. The family is tired. They have done no single heroic thing that would make a monument. They have simply lived under rules, adjusted, saved, waited, worried, and continued. That was the home front for millions of people. Not one grand sacrifice, but thousands of small ones. Not constant drama, but constant adjustment. Not the end of ordinary life, but ordinary life placed under pressure until every object seemed to ask what it was for. The war reached into homes and told civilians that their habits mattered. Some of those lessons were necessary, some were unfair, some were temporary, some lasted for the rest of their lives. And long after the lights came back on, after the shelves filled, after the cars moved faster, after the ration books became keepsakes, the people who had lived through it knew something that is easy to forget in times of comfort. A home can feel private, but history can still find its way in.